Chapter 3888. They could have had a beautiful love. Su Mo felt pity for them if they continued living like this. And Kong Qiao, she admitted, was her own selfish motive. Su Mo stood by the door and took out a cigarette. Hina saw it as soon as he lit it up. Hina's face was filled with surprise. It wasn't because Manager Su smoked. Which PR staff didn't smoke? But smoking in front of Xiao Ye's office, only Manager Su had the guts to do so. Hina walked over and coughed lightly. Manager Su, how did it go with Xiao Yi? Su Mo put on his mask the moment he looked up. He chuckled. I got scolded and smashed things. As a senior fan of Kong Qiao, Secretary He's face was full of disappointment. Then this program must have been aborted. What a pity. Su Mo smiled. Kong Qiao will appear at Stars Entertainment's annual party on time. Secretary He's mouth opened wide in surprise. He stuttered, Oh? Manager Su, how did you convince CEO Yi? He even swore before. His attitude was like a love rival. Love rival. Su Mo snuffed out the cigarette. Didn't CEO Yi say anything? Secretary He's mouth opened wide again. This time, he couldn't close it for a long time. It was too shocking. Xiao Yi wasn't without weaknesses, however, even if Manager Su knew that Kong Qiao was CEO Ye's love rival, how could he still dare to invite him? Secretary He looked at Su Mo's back in admiration. What kind of courage did he have? This was like plucking the fur off a tiger's butt. Secretary He thought of what Manager Su said. He said that the scene would be beautiful. Thinking about it this way, it was beautiful. It was too beautiful. She rubbed her hands together excitedly. At this moment, the office door opened. Yi Mubai stood at the door expressionlessly. His voice was so low that it was freezing. Secretary He, you seem to be very happy. Secretary He was stunned. Then, she defended herself. Being happy is also wrong. He glared at her and closed the door. Secretary He thought that Xiao Yi couldn't be eavesdropping through the door. Did he hear what she said to Manager Su? Secretary He was worried, so he leaned against the door to eavesdrop, but he couldn't hear anything, so he gave up. On the other side, Yi Mubai's heart was like a fucking dog. But as a man, losing without a fight was very shameful and unconvincing. Even with the disturbance during the day, he still went to the cocktail party at night with Su Mo. Su Mo had the advantage of being a good drinker. In the past few years, Yi Mubai had been in good health, so Su Mo was usually the one to drink the less important drinks. When Yi Mubai left the hotel, it was already past 10 o'clock at night. He drove himself and ordered the chauffeur to send Manager Su back. Although he usually used and ordered Su Mo a lot, he was not a bad boss. His bottom line was her innocence. He would not let Su Mo sleep with him. Another thing was her safety. After all, Su Mo was a very important person to Wen Yuan, one of his few friends. Yi Mubai drove a champagne-colored Mulsanne, fastened his seatbelt, and headed toward the villa area where he lived. When he returned home, it was almost 11 o'clock. The car slowly drove through the black carved gate. The lights in the villa's garden lit up instantly. He turned the steering wheel and parked the car. When he unfastened his seatbelt, he looked up at the second floor. The lights were already off. Wen Yuan should be asleep. Her schedule was very accurate. She slept at 10 o'clock at night. Wonderful book house. Chapter 3889. Yi Mubai looked at her silently for a while before he opened the car door. The servant was still waiting for him. She asked softly, Sir, do you want to have supper? Yi Mubai waved his hand. No need. He walked upstairs and turned back after 2 steps. Did Mrs. Yi go anywhere today? The servant shook her head. She didn't go anywhere. She has been doing housework upstairs. Then she couldn't help but add, Mrs. Yi doesn't have such a good temper. Yi Mubai smiled faintly and didn't say anything else as he went upstairs. The second floor was quieter than the one downstairs. Maybe it was because there was no sound or light. He went to see Xiangnan first. The little guy was sleeping soundly. His little face was calm, and he was much taller than 2 years ago. He was almost 1 meter tall. He looked at him quietly, reached out to touch his son's little face, and covered Xiangnan with the quilt. Then he got up and went back to the master bedroom. In the past 2 years, he and Wen Yuan lived an ordinary life. They didn't quarrel or argue, but they lacked intimacy. In the past, he was still flattering to her. Later, she became cold to him. He was so busy that he didn't have the mood and patience to flatter a woman all the time. Later, it was neither good nor bad. Yi Mubai thought so in his heart. He took off his tie, rolled it up, and put it on the sofa. The bedroom was dark. The light was not turned on. Yi Mubai took off his coat while looking at Wen Yuan on the bed. Ever since he came in, she had been sleeping peacefully. He took off his belt and shirt. He let out a long sigh of relief. He didn't know what he was angry about. He was the one who came home late, and he was also the one who went to socialize. She was docile and stayed at home quietly. She took good care of herself. Her body was as satisfied as it was many years ago. What else could he be dissatisfied with? Yi Mubai walked into the bathroom. When he came back, he woke her up a little rudely. He kissed her lips and moved his hand down. When Yuan woke up, she smelled the faint alcohol in his mouth. It was a little warm and a little intoxicating. Her voice was a little hoarse. Yi Mubai, do it once. His voice was soft and husky as he lowered his body and kissed her deeply. Wen Yuan was still in a daze, but she instinctively hugged his neck and endured him. He was a little rough tonight, unlike the usual times when he would tease her until she couldn't take it anymore and begged for mercy. Tonight he seemed to be angry. Wen Yuan didn't know why he was angry. She clearly hadn't provoked him in the past few days. She was very soft, and she rarely rejected him when it came to matters of a married couple, unless she was really uncomfortable. Thus, Yi Mubai had always been used to doing whatever he wanted. When he was in the mood, he would hug her. In the past 2 years, they hadn't interacted much in other areas, but they hadn't neglected this aspect. There was a hint of anger in his voice, so he did not stop like he usually did. Instead, he was like a beast that could not rest. When Yuan slowly sobered up and could smell the alcohol in his mouth, she couldn't stand it anymore. She pushed his shoulder and frowned. Yi Mubai, have you been drinking? Holding her slender waist, he answered her absent-mindedly, yes, I'm fine. Didn't I say I attended a cocktail party? I drank a little. When Yuan sobered up a little again, she looked up at the handsome man above her. You drove back by yourself? He grunted again. At this moment, he preferred to do it with her instead of chatting. When Yuan bit his lip and pushed him away when he was being so perfunctory. Miao Shu Wu Calm. Chapter 3890. Discontentedly, he grabbed her and trapped her under his body again. What's wrong? Are you not feeling well? When Yuan's face was buried in the pillow and her long hair was scattered messily on the pillow. His eyes were burning with anger as he trapped her. At this moment, he was a little excited and became slow, not as impatient as before. When Yuan gritted his fists and said in a broken voice, You still drove after drinking? Your heart hurts, doesn't it? His handsome face leaned against her neck and said passionately. His breath was so hot that when Yuan almost couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to move away, but he wouldn't let her and pressed her down, insisting that she answer. When Yuan was furious. He came back late and drove drunk. How could he be rude? She refused to speak, so he rubbed against her until her heart was trembling. When Yuan then gritted his fists. It doesn't hurt. He chuckled and tormented her even more intensely. It had been a long time since he had been so impulsive. He didn't care about anything and just wanted her to beg him and say what was in her heart. In the end, when Yuan gave in, she cried after saying that. Yi Mubai knew that he had bullied her too much tonight and ended it hastily. He didn't enjoy it anymore. It was already past 1 p.m. and he was more clear-headed. Lying flat on his back, he turned his head after a while. Do you want to take a shower? When Yuan turned his body and slowly pulled up his pajamas. He didn't say anything, but his attitude was obviously angry. Yi Mubai kissed her shoulder and said hoarsely, You really don't want to shower? She didn't speak for a long time. He curiously leaned over to take a look and saw that she had already fallen asleep. Yi Mubai was a little speechless and his heart felt stifled. What kind of life was this? She didn't care about it at all? Did she not enjoy it at all apart from being forced earlier on? He looked at the conservative pajamas she was wearing and even felt that she was purposely lowering his desire to not have sex with him. Feeling stifled, he finally lifted the blanket and went to take a shower. He went outside to smoke 2 cigarettes before returning to the bedroom. Feeling frustrated, he pulled her into his arms and bit the soft flesh behind her ear from behind. Wen-Yuan had to wake up even if he didn't want to. With the way he was acting, even the dead had to come back to life. She opened her eyes and said helplessly, "I want to sleep. What's wrong with you today?" He vented his anger and listened to what she said. Then his anger disappeared. Inexplicably. He wondered if menopause was coming, just like Suemo had said. He didn't make things difficult for her anymore. He let go of her and lay down. "I'm going to bed. I have to wake up early tomorrow." Wen-Yuan also lay down and told him something. "Xiangnan School has a parent-teacher conference tomorrow. Are you going or should I go?" Yi Mubai closed his eyes and thought for a moment. "I have a meeting tomorrow morning. You go. Remember to dress nicely." Wen-Yuan continued, "Mom said that she wanted to enroll Yi Fenghui in childcare today, but I didn't agree to it straight away. I wanted to ask for your opinion." Yi Mubai's voice was buzzing. "Yi Hui is too young. Why should she go to childcare? I'll talk to my mother about this." He seemed to be unhappy again. She didn't know what she had done or said wrong again. He looked at her sideways, his head very close to hers. "Wen-Yuan, other than these trivial family matters, don't you have anything else to say to me?" Wen-Yuan's gaze was a little distant. "Yi Mubai, I'm at home every day. Other than trivial family matters, what else can I say to you?" Wonderful Book House. Chapter 3891. He frowned. "Do you want to work?" Without waiting for her to say anything, he said, "Xiangnan is only 6 years old, and Yi Hui is only 3 years old. They are very young and need their mother to take care of them." Wen-Yuan closed his eyes. "I don't fly around all day. I just want to go to school to teach. Auntie will take care of them during the day, and I can take care of them at night." Yi Mubai frowned. "Have you thought about it?" Wen-Yuan didn't say anything. He closed his eyes. "Isn't it good to stay at home? Many people envy your life." He hoped that she wouldn't have to do housework, but Wen-Yuan didn't think so. She wanted to live an ordinary life, so she was rarely willing to go out with him to socialize. After refusing several times, he didn't ask her anymore. And if this celebration wasn't a particularly important occasion, she would also refuse. He said so Wen-Yuan didn't discuss this topic with him. After a long time, she said something that wasn't a family matter. "Tomorrow afternoon, I want to see the teacher." Because it was Kong Qiao's mother, she still told him about it. She didn't want him to misunderstand. Yi Mubai listened, blinked his eyes and looked at the ceiling. After a long time, he whispered, "I don't want to restrict your freedom, but I don't want you to go out to work." Wen-Yuan thought that it would be more appropriate for him to replace "go out to work" with "go out to work." She didn't want to fight with him, and she was too lazy to fight like this. So they lived a peaceful life for 2 years. He didn't want her to go out to work. He said that the child was still young, and she would listen to him. Such a conversation ended in discord. They slept separately, but it was still far from falling out. It was just that it was a little boring. She didn't know why he didn't develop his power and influence. If that was the case, he probably wouldn't have so much time to care about her. Wen-Yuan thought so. Early the next morning, she finally knew why he was abnormal. After breakfast, the driver sent Xiangnan to school. Wen-Yuan helped Xiangnan carry the small school bag, rubbed his son's little head, and said with a smile, "Xiangnan, be a good boy." Xiangnan nodded and waved to her. "Goodbye, Mom." The little and handsome boy blinked. "See you later." Wen-Yuan sent his son to the car with a smile. He watched the car drive out of the gate before returning to the hall. Yi Mubai was still there. She remembered that he said he had an important meeting last night. She wondered why he hadn't left when it was already 8 o'clock. She had a parent-teacher meeting at 10, so she had to go upstairs to prepare. Xiangnan hoped that she would dress prettily. When passing through the hall, Yi Mubai called out to her. "Wen-Yuan." She turned sideways. "Yi Mubai, aren't you going to work?" Yi Mubai's gaze landed on her face and he put down the newspaper in his hand. Come here. I have something to tell you. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over and stood in front of him. Yi Mubai looked at her. Why don't you sit down? I'm not your superior, yet you're acting even more respectful than Su Imo. When Yuan sat beside him. What's the matter? He turned his head and his gaze was still on her face. After a long time, he said in a low voice, the company's second anniversary celebration next month. Su Imo invited Kong Qiao. When Yuan was surprised. But Su Imo clearly knew about the past. Yi Mubai looked at her and smiled. He seemed to be very relaxed. Why didn't she tell you that she likes Kong Qiao? He said this with a very sinister intention, almost as sinister as Su Imo. Miao Shu Wu. Chapter 3892. Su Imo asked Kong Qiao to accompany her. She watched as the woman she loved was embraced by a man. Now, he told Wen Yuan that Su Imo liked Kong Qiao. No matter what, Wen Yuan couldn't be intimate with Kong Qiao. Wen Yuan was very concerned about Su Imo. Sometimes, Yi Mubai even felt that Su Imo had surpassed him. That was why Su Imo dared to be so arrogant in the company. Of course, her ability was also certain. She worked very hard. Many times, she drank so much that she almost vomited. The next day, she still went to work or was still sharp at the negotiation table. Her willfulness was also because of her. No one in Stars Entertainment could replace Su Imo. She knew this very well. That was why she dared to provoke her boss again and again. Except for Wen Yuan, who couldn't be touched, she was cutting his flesh all the time. Yi Mubai didn't care about this. He even felt that Su Mo's arrangement was quite good. That scene was very beautiful, especially after he knew that Wen Yuan was going to see Kong Qiao. He didn't object because they still had to live together. He knew that every Christmas, Kong Qiao would send gifts for her, Yi Hui, and Xiang'an. Wen Yuan accepted them, so he would also see them. He also noticed that Kong Qiao gave Wen Yuan the most precious things. The two children were simply incidental. Later, Yi Mubai also began to give her gifts. All kinds of expensive jewelry, bags, and clothes. Wen Yuan casually stuffed them in the changing room. There were a lot of them, but she didn't use them. Kong Qiao's things, on the other hand, were neatly packed in a cabinet. She didn't use them. She just took them out from time to time to look at them. Yi Mubai never dared to ask Wen Yuan if she had feelings for Kong Qiao. He didn't ask because he couldn't bear the possible consequences. He didn't want to break this balance. If he didn't break it, she would always be his wife. Even if they were lukewarm now, he wouldn't be satisfied in this marriage. However, he didn't want a divorce. He never thought about it. He didn't know what Wen Yuan thought, but he didn't allow her to think too much. The two children were the best rope to trap her. He used it with ease. Yi Mubai's words surprised Wen Yuan. She looked at him and said slowly, Su Imo likes Kong Qiao? He revealed an extremely faint smile, and then said in a seemingly absent-minded manner, What? You don't know? I thought your relationship with Su Imo was quite good. Is she hiding it from you? Wen Yuan looked at him. Are you trying to sow discord between me and Su Imo? Is it that obvious? Yi Mubai didn't get angry. He said slowly, You think she invited Kong Qiao because she wanted to help you? It's actually for herself. After saying that, he reached out and pinched her cheek. Don't forget to bring a gift when you visit her in the afternoon, or it will be very rude. He paused again. I have time in the afternoon. Do you want me to accompany you? She was still shocked by what he had said about Su Imo, and it took her a long time to reply, No need. He didn't force her. All right, I'll go home early tonight. Let's have dinner together as spending time with our son. He said it very gently. It was completely different from the way he was in bed last night. So, when Yuan was a little dazed for a moment, Yi Mubai patted her hand. All right, I'm going to work. You go to school. You can send a WeChat message to the teacher if she says anything. When Yuan said okay, got up and left. He drove the Mulsan that he usually drove. As soon as he left, Mrs. Lin, the servant of the family, came over. Miao Shu Wu Calm. Chapter 3893. Mrs. Lin is the one who cares about the couple the most. she says softly, "Madam, you can't do this. You have to let your man accompany you when he's free. If you don't let him accompany you, he'll spend time with the little vixen." Wen Yuan laughs. "Where did the little vixen come from?" Then he shakes his head. "Also, Aunt Lin, you're eavesdropping on us again." Aunt Lin touches her head in embarrassment. "It's because Mr. and Mrs. are so good-looking. It's like watching an idol drama." "No, no, no, Mr. and Mrs. are even better looking than the male and female leads in the drama. Mr. and Mrs. are so good together. I heard that he used to be the best actor, and now he's rich. Many girls want to throw themselves at him. Madam, you have to keep a close eye on them. Men are actually like dogs." Aunt Lin becomes more and more excited. "Men are like dogs. You have to keep a leash on them. If they run around, they'll be locked up at home. If they're let out all the time, they'll pee everywhere and leave a mark. This is actually a signal to attract those bitches. You can't do that. If necessary, you have to hang a dog tag around your neck to declare your ownership." Wen Yuan is amazed. Aunt Lin's theory of men are like dogs and women's rights is probably because she has heard too much of Lin Luoran's poisonous chicken soup. He looks at Aunt Lin and says, "Bitches don't pee when they go out?" Aunt Lin's old face is stunned, and then she says embarrassedly, "That's a physiological need." Wen Yuan looks at the time. "I have to prepare for Xiangnan's parent-teacher conference." Aunt Lin immediately says, "Yes, yes, yes, you can't forget this. Madam, I told you that you can go, but don't let Mr. go. Xiangnan's female teacher is very young. When she sees Mr., she probably pee in the corner." Wen Yuan rolls his eyes. "No one can take your man away from you. Aunt Lin, don't say such things in the future." Auntie Lin watched Wen Yuan go upstairs and wrung the corner of her clothes, feeling wronged. "Madam, you knew that Xiangnan's teacher seduced Sir. You almost hugged him when you came to our house. Moreover, wasn't home visits once a year not enough? Later on, once a month was an exaggeration. It was the same frequency as a woman's period. Madams were very patient. These women's conscience had been eaten by dogs. They wanted to snatch someone else's husband, and they were so brazen. If it was her, she would have beaten them up long ago. Let's see if they still had any face left." Wen Yuan had already reached the second floor. He leaned over and said, "He came a few times, but he didn't come back anymore." Aunt Lin looked at her, and after a while, she said in a low voice, "Madam, you really are a good woman." Everyone in the family could see that Sir cared a lot about Madam, but Madam had always been indifferent to Sir. Sir was so handsome and rich, why didn't Madam throw herself at him? Wen Yuan went to change her clothes. Since it was Xiangnan's parent-teacher conference, she dressed in a set of Chanel's latest black trousers with a bead necklace around her neck. Her long black curly hair was tied up, and she put on some makeup, changed into high heels, and picked up her handbag. There wasn't much time left. She also took a set of antique porcelain cups that she bought in England. She was going to give them to Kong Qiao's mother later. When she went downstairs, Aunt Lin's eyes lit up. "Madam, you are so beautiful." According to her, the Taiping dynasty was too simple. Which family's wife didn't wear jewels and jewels every day? Her family's wife didn't wear any makeup every day. If she wasn't gardening at home, she would be doing housework. WonderfulBookhouse.com. Chapter 3894. She was living like a retired old man at such a young age. She didn't accompany her husband to socialize and wasn't afraid that her husband would change his mind. There were a lot of things written about her husband in the newspapers. Madam wasn't worried at all. Seeing that Wen Yuan was enlightened, Aunt Lin was very happy for her. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. "I just can't let Xiangnan be unhappy." She was dressed in expensive clothes, but she was as elegant as a camellia flower. She drove there herself. The car was also chosen by Yi Mubai for her. It had good performance and high safety. It wasn't particularly expensive, and it was only a car that cost more than 2 million yuan. Wen Yuan wasn't a particularly ostentatious person either. She drove to Xiangnan School for a parent-teacher conference. Xiangnan was very happy. After all, in Xiangnan's heart, Wen Yuan was the best mother. However, to Wen Yuan, this kind of conference was quite boring. The whole time, the teacher was hinting, giving gifts, and asking about which family's parents were powerful. When Yuan felt that this kind of occasion should be attended by Yi Mubai, he could handle it much better than her. Fortunately, she managed to get away after an hour and a half. Xiangnan waved his little hand and said goodbye to her. Yi Xiangnan was very satisfied today. For a boy, looking better than his mother was the most meaningful thing because he didn't have a wife yet. When Yuan went over and kissed him again, then walked to the parking lot and drove away. Kong Qiao's mother asked her out for lunch. She cooked personally. When Yuan couldn't refuse, and she didn't want to either. She hadn't seen her teacher for a long time. She got into the car and buckled her seatbelt. She received a WeChat message from Yi Mubai, asking her about the parent-teacher conference. When Yuan looked at the time, it was 11:30. Was his conference over? She carefully worded her words and sent a message. It's still going on. It'll be a while before it ends. Yi Mubai quickly replied, come to the office after the conference. Let's have lunch together. I'll send you there later. This was a very controlling message. She didn't know if it was because his business had become bigger in recent years, but he was different from before. Although he was very good to her, he wasn't easy to talk to. Otherwise, when Yuan wouldn't be at home all the time. Of course, when Yuan wouldn't let him drive him, so he slowly replied, I have a date with Shirley. There was no movement from the other side for a long time, so when Yuan added another message, didn't you say we'd have dinner together tonight? What do you want to eat? I'll ask Aunt Lin to make it. Yi Mubai sat on the sofa and looked at his phone with an unfathomable expression. Bai Xueli, who was sitting opposite him, asked, Old Bai, why did you call me over? Yi Mubai looked up at her. After a long time, he said, let's eat. I thought something happened to you and when Yuan. Bai Xueli patted herself. You scared me. Why don't we call when Yuan over? No need, just the two of us. She might not be free, Yi Mubai said expressionlessly. Then he wrote on his phone. Then he put away his phone and got up. Aren't we going to eat? Let's go. Bai Xueli followed behind him. Elder Bai, you look weird. Is there really nothing going on between you and Wen Yuan? He paused. Bai Xueli accidentally bumped into his nose. He looked at her. We came 3 times last night. Yi Mulin's little worm blushed instantly and almost jumped up. What 3 times? Old Bai, you're really shameless now. He glanced at her. Aren't you concerned about my love life with Wen Yuan? Come. Wonderful Book House. Chapter 3895. How could Bai Xueli dare to care about him anymore? She pursed her lips and followed behind him. I won't ask. After a while, she couldn't help but ask, I heard that Kong Qiao is back. Is Lao Bai really okay? Then she looked at Lao Bai's face. His expression was very interesting. He obviously cared about him, but he pretended not to care. Men were all stubborn. When Yi Mubai got in the car, he suddenly asked Bai Xueli, do you love my brother? Of course. Bai Xueli pursed her lips, although sometimes I'm very angry and want him to explode on the spot. Yi Mubai just smiled and started the car. Bai Xueli asked, are you suspecting that Wen Yuan doesn't love you? Wen Yuan used to be more passionate than me. As Yi Mubai drove, he said calmly, surely it's the same as before. It's different now. Bai Xueli looked at his side profile seriously and sighed, Lao Bai looks like a loveless young man now. We are an old couple. What can't be solved in bed? If it doesn't work once, we can do it twice. If it doesn't work twice, we can do it 4 times. Once a night. She didn't say that she loves me. He replied. Bai Xueli looked at him and swallowed her saliva. Did Lao Bai accidentally lose his mind and reveal the privacy of a couple to her? 5 times? That was very loving. At least it was not a problem for Lao Bai. Most of the things in bed were decided by the man. If the man was not interested, it would be useless. She didn't know what to say, so she stayed silent and accompanied Lao Bai. After a while, Yi Mubai whispered, Xueli, although I don't want to admit it, I can't lie to myself. She doesn't love me anymore. Bai Xueli whispered again, Wen Yuan is more introverted. He doesn't talk about love like me. It seems that you are living well. He smiled bitterly. She has been putting up with me. Bai Shueli didn't know how to comfort him. Lao Bai was too much. He was already so old, yet he still wanted to be in love. His wife was his, and the person who hugged Wen Yuan every night was also him. What else could he be dissatisfied with? In her limited brain, she did not think that this was because of the depth of her love. She could not obtain it, so she was unwilling and sad. She accompanied Yi Mubai to have a stressful lunch. After lunch, she took his car back to his company and then took a taxi home. She was afraid that he would get distracted while driving. Sitting in the taxi, Bai Shueli thought about it and called Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan was a little surprised when he received Bai Shueli's call. Shueli? Bai Shueli shouted. Wen Yuan, is there any problem with the He family's old Bai recently? Wen Yuan was at Kong Qiao's mother's house, and Kong Qiao was there as well. It was not convenient for her to talk, so she went to the balcony to talk. What's wrong? Why do you ask? Bai Shueli said slowly, I was eating with Lao Bai just now. He was acting weird. Did Wen Yuan update early? Is that why you're so sentimental? Wen Yuan was stunned. Eat with him? Chapter 3896. Wen Yuan didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but her heart still sank. He didn't say that Shirley was with him. After hanging up the phone, Wen Yuan looked at the phone for a long time. She didn't know if she should make a call to explain. While she was hesitating, Kong Qiao leaned on the side and said, What's wrong? Wen Yuan put away the phone. Nothing. It's Shirley. But it's related to Yi Mubai, isn't it? Kong Qiao smiled faintly. He wouldn't be so strict about the time of a meal, would he? Wen Yuan shook her head. No, he knows I'm here. But he doesn't know I'm here. Kong Qiao's eyes were burning. Wen Yuan, do you want to continue living like this? Living in that big golden cage, being spoiled and envied by countless women, but are you happy? Have you ever asked yourself if you still love the man next to you? Have you ever been perfunctory with him? Are you living with him because you love him or because of Xiangnan and Yi Hui? Wen Yuan's hand touched the phone. She lowered her eyes and then looked up. Kong Qiao, what I want to tell you is that Yi Mubai isn't the only one who doesn't know you're here. I don't know either. There's no past between us. Whether Yi Mubai and I are good or bad, I have my own feelings. Please don't control me, okay? For Wen Yuan, Kong Qiao was a beautiful memory. She didn't want him to get involved between her and Yi Mubai. No matter how boring this marriage was, she had no intention of getting a divorce, let alone having an extramarital affair. The last thing she wanted was to involve Kong Qiao. So although her words were not pleasant to hear, she still made it clear to him. She didn't want Kong Qiao to become the second Wen Yuan. Chasing someone else's footsteps wouldn't make people happy. She said this to Kong Qiao. Kong Qiao frowned. Wen Yuan, I just thought, don't think. Kong Qiao, let me say it again. My relationship with him has nothing to do with you. Whether it's good or bad, it's not because of you. It was the first time she spoke to him in such a tough manner. She probably felt that his appearance today was not simple. He must have known that she was coming, so he purposely came over. She knew that Kong Qiao and her teacher didn't live together. Her teacher liked to live in this kind of old neighborhood because it was lively. Kong Qiao lived in a luxurious condominium in the city. Wen Yuan was at a loss when he came over. She did not like to be stuck in the middle of two relationships, so she told him directly. After Wen Yuan finished speaking, Kong Qiao just smiled and said, I just wanted to tell you that I have a girlfriend. Wen Yuan was a little confused, and then he felt a little uncomfortable. She seemed to have blamed him wrongly in a moment of desperation. Kong Qiao looked at her, saw that she was as beautiful as ever. She had always been beautiful, gentle, and graceful. She was very beautiful today. He heard that she went to the parent-teacher conference, but he still felt amazed. He looked down at her and said softly, It's Su Mo. You know him, don't you? Wen Yuan remembered what Yi Mubai said this morning. He said that Su Mo liked Kong Qiao. Was it true? She was at a loss of what to do. She flipped her hair. I don't know. Kong Qiao, I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. Maybe you were just doing it for my own good. She looked up and smiled at him. He knew very well that she was panicking. She was afraid that Yi Mubai would misunderstand that she still had that man in her heart, and she just thought that she didn't love him anymore. Yi Mubai was the same. He doubted everything, but he shouldn't doubt Wen Yuan's love. Chapter 3897. They were a little uncomfortable, but Mrs. Kong came over to ask them to eat, which eased the tension. Wen Yuan smiled, walked over to talk to the teacher, and helped set the dishes. Mrs. Kong talked to Wen Yuan with a smile on her face, but she sighed in her heart. She couldn't be clearer about her son's feelings. He obviously hadn't given up. She could see that her son liked Wen Yuan in the past, but Wen Yuan's family was very rich at that time, while the Kong family was just a well-off family. Kong Qiao was a proud child. He had never said that he wanted to go abroad, and he wanted to find Wen Yuan after he became famous. But love waited for no man, and there were many people who liked a girl like Wen Yuan. But Wen Yuan didn't choose from those who liked her, but plunged into the big hole that was Yi Mubai. At that time, she came to play the piano, and Kong Qiao came back from abroad. Wen Yuan talked to him about Yi Mubai's movies, Yi Mubai's appearance, and Yi Mubai's clothes. At that time, she knew that her son was destined to be lost. Wen Yuan was a girl with her own ideas. She went through a lot, and finally married Yi Mubai. Until now, so many years had passed, but her son still didn't give up and was still single. As a mother, how could she not see through her son's mind? This time, it was good to give up. Although Mrs. Kong also liked Wen Yuan and wanted her to be her daughter-in-law, they were not destined to be together. Mrs. Kong sighed in her heart. After setting the dishes, she called Kong Yuan over for dinner. It was a reunion after a long time, but everyone enjoyed it. After dinner, Wen Yuan took the initiative to wash the dishes, chatted with the teacher, and then drank tea. She didn't leave until about 3 in the afternoon. Kong Qiao saw her off, and the two walked out of the alley together. They didn't talk until they reached Wen Yuan's car. Before Wen Yuan got in the car, she turned to look at Kong Qiao, hesitated for a moment, and said, "Su Mo is a good girl. Treat her well." Kong Qiao suddenly said, "What about me? What do you think of me?" Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment and then smiled, "Very good. I'm very good. Why didn't you like me back then?" This was the first time he asked this question. Wen Yuan was confused again and couldn't answer him for a long time. After a long time, she thought it through. "I was still young and I was fascinated by a lot of things. And now?" Kong Qiao didn't seem to want to let her go. She chuckled again. "Yi Mubai's appearance has been through so many years, but it hasn't changed at all. Not only was it not bad, it was even better." Many young girls threw themselves at him. Wen Yuan did not answer his question. He sighed and said, "I'm leaving. Take good care of teacher." Kong Qiao lowered her voice. "Wen Yuan, I don't ask for anything else. I just want to be myself and be truly happy. I will." She smiled and started the car. Kong Qiao watched her leave. Chapter 3898. I'm Co Ye's wife. Is it convenient for me to go up now? Wen Yuan asked softly. The receptionist was taking notes when her hands trembled. She raised her eyes slowly and looked at Wen Yuan from head to toe. Then she opened her mouth and couldn't speak properly. Yes, I'll send you to the elevator." Wen Yuan smiled faintly. "I'll go up directly." She carried her handbag and walked to Yi Mubai's exclusive elevator. The two receptionists looked at her back and whispered, "This is what the Empress should look like. So Ye's wife is so elegant and beautiful." "Of course, I heard that she was born into a wealthy family. She has a good life and is different from us grassroots," another one said sourly. Then she added, "It's all fate. There's nothing we can do about it." Wen Yuan walked into the elevator and went straight to the top floor. When she walked out of the elevator, she saw a very petite and slender girl with straight black hair and a delicate face. She passed by Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan stopped. She turned around and looked at the girl's back. She actually felt that she looked like Lin Cece. She felt a pain in her heart. It was an indescribable feeling. And this girl walked out of Yi Mubai's office. Did Yi Mubai keep a photo by his side? Was it for eye candy from time to time, or was it for other purposes? Wen Yuan originally wanted to explain, but now she felt that it was unnecessary. Just when she was about to leave, she saw the office door open. Then came the sound of Su Mo and Yi Mubai's argument. It was quite heated. It was not the first time when Yuan had seen such a scene, so she was not surprised. But they saw her. She couldn't leave. Su Mo originally wanted to argue, but Co Ye's wife was here. She didn't want to argue anymore, so she walked over and whispered, "Wen Yuan, this is a Tyrannosaurus." However, Yi Mubai had always been gentle to Wen Yuan, just like before. Su Mo had no idea that he was even worse in private, especially in bed. A gentle knife was used to describe a man like Yi Mubai. Not only did he treat her gently, but he also had many tricks up his sleeve. He made it impossible for her to reject him, and she had to obediently stay in the web he had woven for her. These were the dark sides of Yi Mubai, which Wen Yuan could not tell others. Moreover, she couldn't tell others about their relationship as husband and wife, nor did she want to. Wen Yuan always kept his distance from others. Su Mo hurriedly left in her high heels. As Wen Yuan walked over, Secretary He came over and whispered, "A newcomer messed up the show just now. Xiao Yi is furious and wants the newcomer to clean up." "Is her acting really that bad?" Wen Yuan looked at Secretary He. Secretary He chuckled. "The young lady is Jin Gei. She's acting in a scene where she's dumping the rubbish. Do you know that she's holding the rubbish bin with 2 fingers? She's acting as the daughter of a poor family. That's ridiculous. It's even trending today. CEO Yi is furious and wants to replace her." Wen Yuan looked at Secretary He and thought for a long time before coughing lightly. "Xiao Yi, didn't you look at her face carefully?" "Face." Secretary He made an sound. "It would have been better if you hadn't mentioned it. That face was done." Wen Yuan was very speechless. Secretary He continued, "Manager Su and CO Yi quarreled because she was the one who brought her out. She was fine before, but last month, I don't know what got into her. She insisted on getting a knife face. Now it's all ruined. Do you think the audience is watching a show or watching a Sichuan face change?" Chapter 3899. Wen Yuan was speechless after hearing Secretary He's words. "Are you trying to blackmail her?" "Of course not." Secretary He lowered her voice. "I just can't stand these girls with bad intentions. They want to be promoted so badly that they don't want a bright future. Why do they want to make themselves into a second-class product?" Secretary He was a shrewd person. Wen Yuan must have noticed the young lady's face when he asked about her. They all knew who she was after, so she purposely helped Xiao Yi whitewash his face. Wen Yuan glanced at Secretary He again. He could see it too. Secretary He said softly, "Madam, I'm going back to the office. Xiao Yi is not in a good mood. Be careful." Yi Mubai's voice was heard. "Secretary He, are you done with the documents I asked you to do?" Secretary He made a bitter face and quickly left DZ. Wen Yuan looked at her back and slowly walked into Yi Mubai's office and closed the door. He sat on the sofa in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, wearing a classic black and white suit shirt. His coat was casually draped over the back of the sofa. He was holding a document in his hand. He seemed to be reading it, but it was more like he didn't see Wen Yuan. From the moment she appeared until now, he had treated her as if she was invisible. Wen Yuan leaned against the door and looked at him. "Yi Mubai." He was still looking down at the document. "Have you finished reading the teacher?" With that, he gestured for her to sit down. "Wait for me to get off work. I still have work to do." Wen Yuan still stood there, motionless and silent. Yi Mubai finally looked at her. He frowned. "Why are you standing there? You know, don't you?" Wen Yuan looked at her and said quietly. Yi Mubai put down the document in his hand. His eyes were indifferent. "Know what? Know that you met Kong Qiao and not Bai Shueli today?" Wen Yuan walked towards him and stood in front of him. "I can explain, I didn't know before, but you lied to me." His voice was a little cold. He looked up at her. "You knew what I cared about the most." Wen Yuan's lips trembled slightly and he lost his temper. "You didn't tell me there was a plastic surgeon in the company, Lin Cece." He sat there without moving. His gaze was unfathomable as he stared at her. After a long time, he chuckled softly. Is that so? You noticed something that I didn't even notice. When Yuan, I thought I didn't care anymore. His words were filled with mockery. Yi Mulin, don't change the topic. I want to negotiate, she said angrily. He was still sitting, talking about Kong Qiao? When Yuan was stunned, Yi Mubai's tone became even colder. I'm not interested in talking about this. When Yuan looked at him, Yi Mubai, I just happened to run into you. He sneered, you just happened to lie to me again? Feeling that he was unreasonable, she bent over to pick up a pillow and threw it at his face. After that, she wanted to run away. But Yi Mubai reached out and grabbed her wrist. His voice was low and hoarse. You've done something wrong, so you want to make a scene? When Yuan struggled a little, but not only did she fail to break free, but she was pulled over and sat on his lap. She was shocked, and then she resisted instinctively. Yi Mubai. He held her slender waist with one hand and stared at her deeply from top to bottom. Chapter 3900. When Yuan, you're my wife. When Yuan felt uneasy because of the intimacy, she called him again, and this time, her voice was trembling. Finally, Yi Mubai said, you're dressed so beautifully today. Is it because you're meeting Kong Qiao? When Yuan couldn't take it anymore. You know it's Xiangnan's parent-teacher conference today. Yi Mubai's slender fingers stroked her face gently. His gaze was probing. After a long time, he said in a low voice, you didn't do this on purpose in the past. When Yuan couldn't take it anymore, she slapped his hand away and said angrily, Yi Mubai, don't be picky. Don't you know whether I'm picky or not? He held her chin forcefully and pressed her down on the sofa. His solid body was on top of hers. He was still holding her sharp chin and his dark eyes were locked on hers. When Yuan's heart was pounding violently, she turned her face away and bit her lip. Yi Mubai, what are you trying to do? Yi Mubai's eyes darkened. What do you think? After saying that, he kissed her lips angrily. It was more like a punishment than a kiss. He was biting her lips. When Yuan couldn't take it anymore, she clenched her fists and hammered his back. However, this little bit of strength was nothing to him. He took her hand off and pinned it on the sofa like a nail. She looked at him in shock and moved her body. Yi Mubai, what are you trying to do? He bent down and his dark eyes flashed with a sense of invasion. He said word by word, what do you think? When Yuan looked at him in disbelief, he kissed her lips again. It was a painful kiss. In just a short while, when Yuan's lips were kissed swollen. When Yuan resisted desperately and tried to get rid of him, but she couldn't break free. At this moment, Yi Mubai could be described as a beast in human clothing. Just as he was kissing her passionately, the door was opened. Secretary He walked in front, and behind him were two senior executives. They had an appointment with CEO Ye's team, but when the door opened, CEO Yi was pressing Mrs. Yi to do evil things. Secretary He couldn't speak as he stared blankly at his superior. After a long while, he stammered, see, Yi Mubai's body stiffened, and then he stopped moving. He leaned his face against Wen Yuan's neck and growled, get out. Secretary He stuck out his tongue and looked at the two men beside him, hinting with his eyes. The three of them scrammed out immediately. The other two didn't understand. Secretary He whispered, Xiao Yi is furious. The two looked at each other and smiled warmly. CEO Ye's way of getting angry was really unique. Inside the office, the luxurious yet reserved decoration showed its extraordinary quality. However, at this time, a man and a woman were entangled on the sofa. When Yuan's voice was extremely hoarse. Yi Mubai, do you want to rape me in a place like this? Rape me? Yi Mubai's hand caressed her face. When Yuan, you are my wife. Remember, only I can do this to you. Probably because of depression and anger, he lost his mind and raped her on the sofa. He had her in the midst of Wen Yuan's screaming and crying, with the ambiguous sounds. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, dusk fell. Finally, in the darkness of the room, everything came to an abrupt end. Wen Yuan's hands and feet were weak. Her face was on the other side, and she said hoarsely, are you done? If you're not done, I don't have the strength to accompany you. End of this chapter. Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 3901. When Yuan, you're my wife too. Yi Mubai leaned against her neck and bit down on her soft ear. The force was neither light nor heavy, making the woman want to scream. He leaned close to her ear and stared at her expression. He smiled coldly. When Yuan, in your heart, what does it matter if we make love? Is it just a form of coping or something? He held her and said, don't say that you don't like it when I do this to you. Do you have to pretend that I'm forcing you every time, huh? When Yuan closed her eyes. She hadn't calmed down yet. Under his coercion, her voice was broken. What do you want to hear? Do you want me to cope with you or something? Yi Mubai ruthlessly bit down on her neck again. It was very painful, and when Yuan wailed miserably. His black hair was disheveled, brushing against his delicate face. It was a very extravagant sight. The clothes on his body had been torn to shreds by him and could no longer be worn. Only his stockings were hanging loosely. This Wen Yuan was very sexy and had a kind of sadistic beauty. It was completely different from his usual self. Her heart was still pounding violently, as if she hadn't recovered from the scene just now. After he bit her, he stared into her eyes. Wen Yuan, does it hurt? You don't even know how to scream in pain, do you? He bit her several times and she cried out, Stop it, Yi Mubai, it hurts. He was still looking at her face, and then he leaned against her neck. You can also feel pain, Wen Yuan. You can actually feel pain too. I thought you'd become numb after all these years. After saying that, he leaned against her neck and panted. Every breath he made was suppressed. Wen Yuan lay there motionlessly. She didn't know what he would do to her next. It was quiet in the office. The lights of the surrounding buildings outside the window were also turned on. After some time, Wen Yuan felt a little cold. She pushed him gently. I'm not feeling well. I want to take a shower. He pressed down on her even more forcefully, not letting her move. After about 5 minutes, he let go of her and sat up slowly. Her clothes were messy, but he was neat and tidy after tidying up a little. Wen Yuan looked even more unkempt in comparison. After a long time, she got up, took his coat and put it on. Do you have any clothes here? Only mine. Yi Mubai lit a cigarette and looked at her. To be honest, she was wearing his jacket and thin stockings. It made him want to. However, he still restrained himself and coldly said, See if you can wear it. She didn't say anything and walked barefoot into his lounge. Yi Mubai held a cigarette in one hand and picked up her dress and the pearl necklace he had torn. After looking at it for a long time, he got up and found a bag to put it away. It was up to her how she would deal with it. He wouldn't leave it in the company and let others see it as a joke. When Yuan was still showering, he patiently walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looked out, and smoked. In the office, there was a unique atmosphere of love between a man and a woman. It was quite seductive. Yi Mubai's eyes were very gloomy. In the past 2 years, he and Wen Yuan had a stable life as a married couple, but most of it was just following the rules. They had never lost control like tonight. As a man, it was actually very enjoyable, but it might not be good for Wen Yuan. He remembered that when he was rough, she kept crying out in pain, but he didn't let her go. On one hand, he enjoyed it, but on the other hand, he was really angry. She came here today to explain and apologize. She let him do it like this. Was it flattery? Wen Yuan usually wasn't so easy to talk to. End of this chapter. Hurry up and read the latest update. Can you get your face back? Could he even make subtle expressions? Ask Su Mo to make arrangements not to come to this floor in the future. Perhaps this girl had a bright future in the past, but it was impossible for her to become an actress after her face had undergone plastic surgery. At first, he signed her because her face was recognizable. Now, other than the European-style double eyelids and the overly thin nose, he didn't think there was anything about her that left a deep impression. In other words, in his heart, she had been abandoned. Even the film had to be res-hot. The audience didn't want to see her face change. The girl's face was pale, just like the female lead in a Korean drama. Her voice was very soft. Suyi, please give me another chance. I really need money. End of this chapter. Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 3903. When Yuan, you are my wife. Yi Mubai pressed the elevator button and ignored the girl. Seeing that he had a heart of stone, the girl turned to look at Wen Yuan. Mrs. Yi, please tell Xiao Yi that I really need this job. Wen Yuan wanted to say that she didn't care about Yi Mubai's business, but Yi Mubai's expression changed and he called Secretary He over. Deal with it. Don't let her come to this floor in the future. His voice was a little cold as he continued, let Su Mo deal with it. If she doesn't, she can't be the manager anymore. Secretary He nodded and watched as Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan walked into the elevator. The girl was still crying. Secretary He pulled out a piece of tissue for her and said earnestly, you have to be realistic. You've seen how much Xiao Yi cares about his wife. Are you purposely slapping Xiao Ye's face with this face of yours? Or are you trying to take advantage of the fact that the couple isn't reconciled? Look at manager Su, Xiao Yi is so close to her. Why is she so close to Xiao Yi and why does she have his trust? That's because she doesn't have any ideas about the boss and has a good relationship with Mrs. Yi. That's smart. Little girl, listen to Sister He's advice and give up on this idea. Go to Korea and get some work done. No matter what you do, you can still come back to the company. Su Mo, please arrange something for you. Maybe you can act in a drama or something in the future. The girl bit her lip and tears fell. But Xiao Yi will look at me more when I'm like this. Secretary He sighed again. Secretary He sighed again. Even if you put on that person's skin, it won't work. Besides, that person might not even be as important as Wen Yuan in Xiao Ye's heart. Didn't you see just now? The couple is very loving. Don't play with fire. In the end, you'll only destroy yourself. The gains don't make up for the losses. Secretary He had said everything. It was up to the girl whether she listened or not. In the elevator, Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan stood side by side. They didn't speak until the elevator reached the parking lot. Yi Mubai whispered that she had a car and wanted to drive herself. Sit in my car. He threw down these words with a commanding tone. Wen Yuan paused for a moment, but still got into his car. He sat beside him and slowly fastened his seatbelt. Yi Mubai took off his coat and threw it into the back seat. He fastened his seatbelt and looked at her. Don't you have anything to ask? Wen Yuan was dazed for a moment. About what? His gaze lingered on her face for a few seconds before he started the car without saying anything. It was already 7 o'clock at night. After a while, Wen Yuan remembered that she had promised Xiang Nan to have dinner together in the evening. From now on, it would be about 8 o'clock before she drove home. She hurriedly took out her cell phone and looked at it. There were a total of 8 missed calls, all from the villa. Her face was a little hot, thinking that Xiang Nan was waiting for them to eat in the office. She lowered her eyes and said in a very soft voice, I'll make a call back. Xiang Nan is waiting anxiously. Yi Mubai glanced at her and didn't say anything. He just turned off the music in the car. Wen Yuan bit her lip after dialing the number. It was really a little shameful. When the call went through, she gently told Xiang Nan to eat first. Her parents would be home at around 8 o'clock. Xiang Nan replied without thinking, then I'll wait for my parents to come back. Xiang Nan, eat first if you're hungry. Be good. Wen Yuan had always been very gentle with children. There was a faint and relaxed smile on her face because she was chatting with her son. End of this chapter. Chapter 3904. Wen Yuan, you are my wife. Yi Mubai stopped the car at the red light and turned to look at her. Wen Yuan sensed his gaze and looked at him before quickly turning her head away. The smile on her face was a little restrained. Yi Mubai started the car again expressionlessly and listened to her continue talking to her son. After a few minutes, he hung up. Then, she said to him carefully, Xiangnan still wants to eat with us. He said he had some fruit. He focused on driving and didn't reply to her at first. Wen Yuan's face was a little hot. She felt that she had put her hot face on his cold butt. However, she was in the wrong today, so she didn't say anything. At this moment, he spoke up. Looking at the situation in front of him, he said absent-mindedly, Wen Yuan, do you even need to please me when it comes to eating with your son? She was a little surprised. He continued, "You should be angry that I forced you. But you don't even have the courage to be angry now that you've done something wrong?" When Yuan was really a little angry, she bit her lip and glared at him. He didn't say anything else and just focused on driving. His side profile was extremely handsome. At this age, men were the most attractive. When Yuan thought about the girl who had plastic surgery, not only did she want to be in the top position, but she was also attracted to Yi Mubai's looks. When Yuan thought that it was normal for a man like him to be admired by a girl, wasn't she like this in the past? However, she liked the artistic Yi Mubai. It had nothing to do with him now. As her thoughts ran wild, the car drove into the villa where they lived. The car stopped, and when Yuan got out, she wanted to go into the living room, but she suddenly took something out of the car. "I'm going out for a while." Yi Mubai looked at the bag in her hand. She ran to the door, so he knew that she didn't want the servants to see her torn clothes. He didn't stop her and waited for her at the same spot, smoking a cigarette. When Yuan ran out and threw the bag into the trash can outside the door before running back, he looked at her and smiled mockingly. He didn't say anything and went into the living room. Xiangnan had already rushed over and called out, "Daddy." Yi Mubai picked him up. Xiangnan hugged his neck and kissed him. "Daddy, I got 2 more little red flowers today. Our Xiangnan is the best." He praised his son and kissed Xiangnan. Then he carried his son into the dining room. Xiangnan leaned on his shoulder and winked at his mother. "Mom, you've become uglier." Xiangnan's unintentional words attracted the attention of the servants in the family. "That's right, Madam was clearly very beautiful when she went out, but why did she come back with such a set of clothes? Moreover, it looks a little familiar. Isn't this Sir's clothes?" The aunties at home were all elderly people. As experienced people, it was easy to understand. All of them blushed. Really, in broad daylight? But Sir really cares about Madam very much. What kind of husband and wife are so loving when they have 2 children? After a moment of shock, when Yuan's face was very hot, he explained, "Mom's clothes spilled on the coffee." Xiangnan was young, so he believed him immediately. But the elderly servants at home were not easy to fool. They all concluded that the clothes must have been torn by Sir. When Yuan was thin-skinned, he coughed lightly. "I'm going upstairs to change." She quickly went upstairs. Her face was frighteningly hot. She thought to herself that she should buy a similar set on the way. She thought about it as she changed. End of this chapter. Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 3905. When Yuan, "You are my wife." After changing, she turned around and saw Yi Mubai standing behind her. His voice was indifferent. "It's normal for a married couple to do it once in the day. You don't have to make a fuss. The servants in the house are all old people. There's nothing strange about it." When Yuan walked past him and said softly, "That's what you think. What about you? What do you think?" He reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her over in a forceful and slightly barbaric manner. His voice was full of danger. "You want everyone to think that you and I are just nominal? Every day, we just share a blanket and chat without doing anything. Do you want Kong Qiao to think that you've been married for a few years and are still as pure as ice and as clean as jade? I didn't think that way." She blurted out. Then she turned her face away tiredly. "Yi Mubai, don't go too far. I lied, but I did it with good intentions. Don't hold on to it. You've already done it. What else do you want? Do you want to keep talking to me in such a weird tone?" "Weird tone?" He chewed on her words and sneered. "When Yuan, your way of putting it is really unique. But you can't stand talking to me and think that I'm stinky. Is it because you feel especially happy talking to Kong Qiao and talking about art that you're so happy that you're lying to me? You're unreasonable." When Yuan struggled to get away from him. "If you want to quarrel, go ahead. I don't want to quarrel with you." She walked towards the door. He said softly behind her, "When Yuan, you actually don't even want to quarrel with me. In your mind, this marriage is just a compromise. You've never thought of falling in love with me again. To you, I'm just the father of Xiangnan and Yi Hui. I'm just a man who sleeps with you every night to satisfy you. In fact, I'm nothing." Her body froze. She turned around and stood straight with her back against the door. She asked softly, "What are you trying to say? Yi Mubai, are you mistaken? The person who has to do it every night is you. What do you mean by satisfying me? Is the perverted way you did it today to satisfy me?" He stood under the chandelier in the changing room, his handsome face alluring. He was the face that every woman wanted to marry, but at this moment, in Wen Yuan's eyes, he was completely detestable. 2 years ago, he was the one who said that this was fine. He was the one who said that he loved her. Was it wrong for her not to love him? Was it a sin? Or was it because he regretted it and felt that he didn't get what he wanted and was about to fall out with her? Her lying was just a fuse. Wen Yuan smiled. "Yi Mubai, if you're not satisfied with such a marriage, you can..." Before she could finish, he stopped her sternly. "Wen Yuan." Then he stared at her in horror as he walked towards her step by step. His hands were on the door above her, trapping her with his body. He looked down into her eyes and said word by word, "Wen Yuan, don't even think about it." She closed her eyes and turned her face to the side. "Yi Mubai, I don't know how to communicate with you anymore." He looked at her and said in a low voice, "Xiangnan is waiting for us downstairs for dinner. Go wash your face and calm yourself down. Don't let Xiangnan think that Daddy and Mommy are quarreling." His fingers caressed her face gently. With that said, he let go of her and moved her to the side before opening the door and leaving. After he left, Wen Yuan suddenly covered his face. She wasn't the only one who was enduring this marriage. He was repressing it too. She couldn't understand why he didn't consider it since that was the case. They could have discussed it. End of this chapter. Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 3906. Say you love me. One, however, his attitude made her understand that she couldn't bring it up. Otherwise, he might not let her see the children. The current Yi Mubai wasn't the Yi Mubai of the past. When necessary, he would use the ruthlessness of the business world on her. It wasn't that Wen Yuan wasn't afraid. Yi Mubai was like a frog being boiled in warm water. Until now, the 2 children had become her weakness. He knew that all too well. She splashed water on her face in the bathroom and calmed down for a long time before walking downstairs. Downstairs, Xiangnan hugged Yi Mubai. It was rare for him to be so clingy. As a father, he also indulged his son and allowed him to hug him. He had always been stricter with Xiangnan than with Yi Hui. He always felt that he was stricter with boys. Wen Yuan walked down the stairs and sat beside him quietly. Xiangnan looked at her. "Mommy, did you cry?" Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment and smiled. "No, Mommy's eyes hurt a little." Little Xiangnan felt very sorry for his mother. He came over and said, "Mommy, I'll help you blow it." Wen Yuan's heart was a little warm. It was an indescribable feeling. When Xiangnan blew it, it was like a warm breeze. It was especially comfortable and warm. She reached out and rubbed her son's head. "Our Xiangnan is a little warm boy." Xiangnan's little face was a little red. He then asked to sit down and eat. Wen Yuan smiled and reached out to pat his little head again. Xiangnan lowered his head to eat. Obediently, she continued to watch him tenderly. She only blinked when her eyes became a little watery. However, when she finally managed to restrain herself, she saw Yi Mubai's gaze. His gaze was complicated. She didn't understand and didn't want to understand. She didn't dare to understand, so she looked down. He just kept staring at her and didn't say anything. It was getting late after dinner. Wen Yuan accompanied Xiangnan to read for a while. Before going to bed, Xiangnan laid on the pillow and asked softly, "Mommy, did you and Daddy quarrel?" Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment, then he forced a smile. "Why would you ask that? Your father and I are quite close." Xiangnan's little face was deep in thought. He then looked at her. "Really? Don't let your imagination run wild. Of course it's true." Wen Yuan kissed his forehead. "All right, be good and go to sleep." Xiangnan obediently closed his eyes. Wen Yuan stared at his little face in a daze for a while. Xiangnan secretly opened his eyes again. Wen Yuan smiled and asked, "What is it now?" Xiangnan hesitated for a moment before saying, "There's a kid in my class whose parents got divorced." Wen Yuan was stunned. Did her relationship with Yi Mubai make Xiangnan so insecure? She didn't know how to explain it to Xiangnan for a moment. She just smiled. Then they must be separated because they can't live together. Xiangnan, the world of adults is very complicated. Xiangnan immediately asked, Mommy, will you and Daddy not be able to live together one day? When Yuan kissed his son. Because Daddy and Mommy have Xiangnan and Yi Hui. You are all Mommy's babies. Xiangnan stared at her eyes and asked very slowly, What about your father? Does Mommy love Daddy? I heard other kids say that Daddy and Mommy love each other very much. When Yuan had a headache, were all the kids in Xiangnan's class so precocious? In order to make him feel at ease, she had to coax him. Of course Mommy loves Daddy. Yi Xiangnan walked around and finally got the answer he wanted. He went to sleep with satisfaction. End of this chapter. Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 3907. Say You Love Me. 2. When Yuan sat for a while and covered Xiangnan with the quilt. When she left the room, she saw Yi Mubai at the door. He was standing by the door, and she didn't know how long he had been standing there. When Yuan didn't know how much he had heard, she just said in a low voice, Xiangnan is asleep. She wanted to leave, but he said softly behind her, When Yuan, you lied again. She knew what he was referring to. She didn't want to talk to him and walked quickly. However, he didn't let her go. He caught up to her and grabbed her wrist. Don't you have anything to say to me? When Yuan was really angry. She had been tormented by him until now because of a white lie. I'm very tired, Yi Mubai. Can you let me rest? She couldn't bear it anymore. He stared at her. Aren't you tired talking to Kong Qiao? Don't be picky, okay? She closed her eyes. Yi Mubai, do you have to quarrel with me? Or are you too free? If you're too free, go find those women who want to please you. You can do whatever you want with the one in your company who made Lin Cece. I think she will cooperate. After she finished speaking, she felt a little regretful. However, she was really exhausted by him again and again. Yi Mubai's cold gaze fell on her face. After a long time, when Yuan opened her eyes and looked at him, he leaned over to her face and said in a low and hoarse voice, When Yuan, you have no conscience. As he said that, he took a step back. It's you who can't forget the past, not me. It's because you can't forget that Kong Qiao is cute in your heart. And I will always be the man who betrayed you and will always leave you, right? She was speechless for a moment. She even thought of Bai Xueli's words. She said that Yi Mubai should go to the psychology department or the physiology department. She thought that maybe there was something wrong with him because he had been vasectomy for a long time. When Yuan's thoughts were a little chaotic, she was also surprised that she could stay so calm at this time. Perhaps they knew that the peace between them for the past 2 years would erupt one day. It was just a matter of time, and they were also prepared for this day. He vented his dissatisfaction to his heart's content, and she was somewhat numb. After a long time, she said softly, Let's all calm down. Otherwise, Xiangnan will ask me if I love you again. Is it strange? He smiled strangely and asked her the same question, When Yuan, do you love me? In the long hallway, she stood face to face with him. The distance between them was very close, but it also seemed very strange. She didn't even give him a word of love. After a long time, her lips moved. Yi Mubai, say no more. He held his forehead. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. After saying that, he walked straight to the other end of the aisle, while when Yuan was still standing there. She suddenly smiled. When she lied to him, he did not even dare to listen to her lies anymore. She went back to the master bedroom to take a bath. She lay in the luxurious bathtub and looked at the mirror. In the mirror, she saw the bruises all over her body. They were left by him this afternoon, and he said that he wanted to sleep in separate rooms. So be it. He said that he was here to satisfy her. When did she, when Yuan, fall to the point where she needed him to satisfy his lust? Was this how he thought of her? She thought about it indifferently and got up. In front of the mirror, she was shocked by the bruises all over her body. He must have left them on purpose. She recalled that he had been purposely doing this to her for the past few days. End of this chapter. Hurry up and read the latest update. Chapter 3908. Say You Love Me. 3. When Yuan wiped herself clean and quietly walked back to the dressing table in the bedroom. She sat down and applied skincare products bit by bit. She looked at herself in the mirror. Looking at her youthful face, she thought about what Yi Mubai said about love. He asked her if she loved him. Wen Yuan didn't know, but she knew that he didn't love her. What he loved was just how he imagined it to be. The current Wen Yuan wasn't Wen Yuan at all. She was like how she was at home when she was unmarried. She was asked to be gentle and virtuous, suitable to be a wife at home. Just like how she was now. When Yuan looked at herself in the mirror, it was a little strange. Perhaps for a woman, this kind of life was already very happy. But for Wen Yuan, this wasn't what she wanted. Yi Mubai was successful and she was just an accessory to him. She didn't like going out with him because when people introduced her, they would say that she was Mrs. Yi, not Wen Yuan. She hated it when people always called her Mrs. Yi. In her heart, if she wasn't loved, she didn't want to admit that she was his. Wen Yuan might have said these words to him in the past, but she wouldn't do it now. Marriage was like stagnant water, and she was just used to it. But she had never been satisfied. Wen Yuan changed into a set of white pajamas and laid on the bed. It was late at night, and she felt very comfortable being alone. She couldn't sleep, so she took the tablet and chose a romance film to watch. When she was choosing, she saw a film that Yi Mubai had shot before. She didn't know why, but she chose one of his films. It was also the first film when she was crazy about him. It had been more than 10 years since then. When Wen Yuan clicked on it, he felt a little complicated. He looked at the Yi Mubai from more than 10 years ago, and it was as if he was seeing another Wen Yuan. The Wen Yuan who was filled with passion, the Wen Yuan who had infinite possibilities, and the Wen Yuan who was crazy about love. The Yi Mubai from more than 10 years ago was very artistic, completely different from the current Yi Mubai. Wen Yuan found that her heart was still beating fast. She couldn't describe the feeling. The tablet's blue light flickered on her face. She leaned against the headboard of the bed. It was very soft. She stared at Yi Mubai on the screen. She reminisced. She missed those days when she was in love. She replayed it several times and accidentally fell asleep. The blue light on the tablet blinked. Late at night, Yi Mubai stood in front of the French window in the guest room, smoking quietly. He recalled the strange and evasive look on Wen Yuan's face when he asked her if she loved him. Not only did she not love him, but she also did not want to love him. His gaze deepened as he glanced at the bed. Without showering, he lay down and finished the cigarette between his fingers. Closing his eyes, he could smell the familiar scent lingering at the tip of his nose. It was the lingering scent from his sex with Wen Yuan in the afternoon. This kind of aura made him a little restless, and he couldn't fall asleep at all. Yi Mubai lay down for a long time, thinking of that hateful woman. Later, he wondered why he slept in separate rooms and why he let her go. He quietly got up and returned to the master bedroom. The lights in the master bedroom were off, but there was a faint blue glow. He walked closer and saw that the tablet beside her hand was playing a video. He reached out to take it and saw that it was a video of him in the past. Yi Mubai was a little surprised. He raised his eyebrows and looked at Wen Yuan. She leaned against the headboard and fell asleep. She was wearing silk pajamas, and her long black curly hair fell on her shoulders. Her face was calm, and she looked very peaceful and beautiful. End of this chapter. Chapter 3909. Yi Mubai looked at it quietly for a while, then turned off the tablet. Then he began to unbutton his shirt. When Wen Yuan woke up, her hands were tied to the round pillar at the head of the bed. She was shocked, struggled, and looked at the man lying on top of her. Yi Mubai, what are you doing? You're awake? His voice was horribly hoarse and he bit her neck. When Yuan turned her face to the side, she didn't know where he learned this perverted way of doing things. He hadn't treated her like this in the past. She closed her eyes. Let go of me. You said I'm your wife. Is this how you treat your wife? This is how you treat other women. He nibbled her chin gently, and his voice was a little low. Wen Yuan, do you know how men treat other women? She was so embarrassed that she didn't want to answer him. Why aren't you talking, huh? His voice was hoarse. Wen Yuan's long eyelashes trembled slightly. What do you want me to say? He chuckled. How do men treat other women, huh? She naturally refused to say it, and turned her face to the side. Wen Yuan, if you don't want to say it, I'll demonstrate, huh? He said in an extremely nasty manner. She turned her head and stared at him in disbelief, and then he had treated her so viciously. He had personally taught her how to treat a woman outside his home. It was despicable, rough, and shameful. Wen Yuan couldn't help but cry in the end. She bit her lips, and her face was slightly red. Her long hair was dripping with sweat on her shoulders, and she looked terrible. Now you know how men treat other women? His warm breath was on her neck, and his voice was low. At this moment, Wen Yuan knew that if she said no, he would treat her even more harshly. She was afraid of Yi Mubai's stamina. She really didn't know how he could have such stamina if he was in the office all day, or if he was just discussing business with others. Her eyes were slightly red, and she looked up. Her red lips, which were swollen from kissing, trembled slightly. Got it? The next second she was hugged tightly by him. Yi Mubai hugged her tightly and buried his face against her neck. His voice was hoarse. Wen Yuan, say you love me. She stared at the ceiling and did not speak for a long time. She was exhausted, but she couldn't sleep because he wouldn't let her go. After a long time, she softly asked, Is it important to you? He did not answer, but nibbled at her neck, loosened the tie on her wrists, clasped her hands around his neck, and kissed her wildly and roughly, as if to melt them into one. He had never done this before. But no matter how hard he pushed, she did not tell him what he wanted to hear. The result of too much indulgence was that the two of them slept late together. When Yi Mubai woke up, it was already 10 in the morning. He picked up the bedside watch and looked at it. Then, he put his hand on his forehead. Last night he had done it about 7 or 8 times. For a man, it was a little too indulgent, but even he was a little too much. Turning sideways, he looked at Wen Yuan lying on her side in the hollow of his shoulder. She was curled up, wearing the pajamas from last night. At this moment, it was a little messy, and she looked very seductive. Wen Yuan was the kind of woman who was like a rich lady when she was in the hall, but like a slut in bed. Although she did not take the initiative, he liked her body and liked to do it with her. This was probably the only harmonious aspect of their rather dull relationship as husband and wife. Of course, she was usually just cooperative. Only when she was particularly aroused would she bite his shoulder uncontrollably and let out a soft moan that he liked. With this thought in mind, he placed his arm across her waist and carefully compared the changes in her figure. After giving birth, her waist was still very slender and soft. She did not look like a woman who had given birth to 2 children at all. The only change was that she was fuller and still very seductive. Yi Mubai carefully compared them, and Wen Yuan woke up in his arms. When she realized what he was doing, she looked down. Why didn't you go to work? End of this chapter. Chapter 39:10. If you sleep late, let's go in the afternoon, or don't go today. He turned over and pressed her down, kissing her neck. Mrs. Yi, I was exhausted last night. Wen Yuan's face was still a little red from last night. She turned her face aside, and her breath was a little unstable. You said we'd sleep in separate rooms. So, was it the end of sleeping in separate rooms? Yi Mubai smiled lightly. I regretted it last night. His fingers gently stroked her face, and he deliberately said in a low and slow voice, You are my wife, and it's your duty to make love to me. Why should I give up such a right? She was a little angry. This is not the way to be a husband and wife. You don't like it. He put his thin lips on her ear and chuckled. I'll change it next time. Wen Yuan really couldn't stand him like this. She closed her eyes gently. Isn't it good to be like before? Wen Yuan, that can't satisfy me. He suddenly said so. She was surprised and slowly opened her eyes to look at him. She didn't know he was always so obsessed. He stared at her, not letting go of any expression on her face. Then he said hoarsely, I want you to love you. He leaned in her ear again and said shamelessly, If you love me, you can do whatever you want. But if you don't love me, I'll do it to you every night. When Yuan turned her face away. Yi Mubai, can you be more shameless? He smiled and let her go. When Yuan didn't want to lie in the same bed with him again, so she lifted the quilt and got up. But at the moment she got up, she frowned. It hurt. She kept the previous position, thinking how many times did he do it to make her like this last night? When she was thinking, an arm wrapped around her waist, and then his voice was hoarse. Does it still hurt? She answered, a little. Her expression was definitely more than a little. Yi Mubai let her lie down, and he got up to get the medicine. She looked at his back in only a bathrobe. He was slender and strong, which looked very sexy. When he came back, she said, why did you change your mind? What? He pressed down on her hip with one hand, not letting her move, and applied medicine for her with the other. This kind of thing was very intimate and shameful. When Yuan bit her lips and endured it. Actually, she wanted to apply the ointment herself, but he wouldn't let her. After wiping it, Yi Mubai screwed the lid back on and placed it in the bedside table. He looked like he was planning to use it for a long time. When Yuan's gaze was a little dazed. Then, he looked straight at her and smiled faintly. I realized that teasing you is much more interesting than giving you the cold shoulder. She got up and walked into the bathroom. Therefore, when Yuan knew that his anger was not over. He had not forgiven her, although she didn't think she was guilty. She leaned against the headboard and lay still for a while, turning her head when he came out. He only had a towel wrapped around his waist, and he was using the towel to wipe the water droplets from his black hair. When Yuan thought of something. I'm going back to my mom's house today. I bought a gift for Wenqing's birthday. He was very opposed to her going back to her parents' house. If she went, he would accompany her. If she was really busy, he would get the chauffeur to take her there, and each trip would not take more than 2 hours. When Yuan thought to herself that he probably didn't like her going back. Actually, she rarely went back and would usually not see him if she could. After she finished speaking, Yi Mubai put down the towel in his hand and looked at her. Must you go? End of chapter. Chapter 39:11. When Yuan pursed her lips and said, I didn't want to go, but my mother called me twice. She thought that he would object, because in his opinion, Wenqing's birthday was just a trivial matter, and it was not worth it for her to go to her mother's house. However, Yi Mubai looked at her for a while and said, I'll go with you. When Yuan was surprised, and then she subconsciously refused, no, I can go by myself, or let the driver drive me. But he seemed to have made up his mind. He took off the bath towel around his waist and said lightly, let's go and see Hui after we go. When Yuan covered her face because of his action. He was really, Yi Mubai didn't care. He thought that there was nothing between husband and wife. He went straight to the changing room to get dressed. When he came back, when Yuan asked, didn't you bring Yi Hui back? He looked at her and buttoned up his shirt. Isn't she fine with my mother? When Yuan couldn't help saying, but Yi Hui is very young, I think. It's just a few days. He thought that she was making a fuss and glanced at her. Don't you think that you have too much family business? It's just a few days to relax. By the way, Xiangnan will start learning the piano this week. You should pay attention to his mood. When Yuan looked at him and said, you didn't discuss it with me. I can teach him. He came over and leaned over to look at her. When Yuan thought that he was going to get angry, but he just reached out and gently touched her face. I don't want you to work too hard. You're just looking for an excuse, aren't you? She stared at his eyes. You just don't want me to touch the piano. You're afraid that when you play the piano, you'll think of Kong Qiao, right? Yi Mubai's expression became cold. He stared at her eyes and then sneered, your analysis is very good. He straightened up and looked at her. I'll wait for you outside. When Yuan knew that he was angry, but she was also angry. Why should he be angry? Would she be happy if he raised her at home and gave her a good life? Would she be happy? He had a strong desire to control her, but she didn't even realize it had come to this. She lowered her eyes and calmed down for a while before getting up to change her clothes, brush her teeth, and wash her face. When she walked downstairs, Yi Mubai was drinking tea. At this moment, his handsome features were charming, and there was no trace of excessive indulgence. When Yuan recalled looking at himself in the mirror just now, it was clear that he hadn't slept well. She silently thought to herself, he clearly used a lot of strength. Hearing her coming down the stairs, he put down the English glass in his hand and said quietly, "Have some breakfast to suppress it before you go." When Yuan wanted to say no, but he had already started reading the newspaper again. He looked like he would not allow any rejection. When Yuan could only eat a little. After he was done, he said, "I'm done." Only then did he lift his eyes to look at her outfit today. It was a very standard outfit. Although it was decent, when Yuan could wear it several times better than this, but she didn't. She always looked normal when she walked out, except for yesterday. Thinking of yesterday, he couldn't help but think of Kong Xiao again. His heart was filled with anxiety, and he picked up the car key. "Let's go." When Yuan followed behind him, holding a gift for Wen Qing in his hand. It was a limited edition Hermes bag, which Wen Qing liked very much. Yi Mubai got into the car, fastened his seatbelt, and then looked at Wen Yuan. "You don't seem to want me to accompany you back to your parents' house?" "No. You're thinking too much," she said in a low voice. End of this chapter. Chapter 39:12. Yi Mubai smiled and started the car. He said calmly, "Am I thinking too much?" She didn't know what was wrong with him. When Yuan thought that he was either late or had some psychological problems. If he had the time, he might as well take care of the artists in the company. That way, he wouldn't go for plastic surgery. He drove all the way to Wen Garden, where Wen Yuan lived before he got married. The Wen family was also very powerful. In the past, it was comparable to the Yi family. However, in the past few years, the Wen family's support had not been enough. It had fallen behind by a large margin. However, with Yi Mulin's relationship, the Wen family's position was still stable. He stopped the car and Wen Yuan got out of the car first. Yi Mubai looked at her as if she was running away. His gaze was a little deep. She might not have realized that she was actually avoiding their marriage. She didn't want to face the fact that she used to love him. So, the current Wen Yuan wouldn't love him. Yi Mubai sat in the car and smoked a cigarette. He puffed slowly. Wen Yuan went in first and saw Wen Qing sitting on the sofa. Sitting next to her was a man with very fair skin. He was the type of overseas returnee that Wen Qing liked. Most of them were involved in investments. At this moment, Wen Qing was almost half leaning in the arms of the muscular man. When she saw Wen Yuan come in, she smiled a little exaggeratedly. "Sister, you're back?" Wen Yuan nodded and passed the bag to her. "You asked for it." Wen Qing opened it. When she saw the style, her eyes lit up. This bag cost more than $1 million and it wasn't something that could be bought with money. The Wen family was rich, but they couldn't spend it like this. Although she was happy, Wen Qing still pretended to be annoyed. "Sister, isn't this style a little too old? It's suitable for a woman in her 30s like you. It's not suitable for a little girl like me." Wen Yuan was speechless. "Then I'll change it for you." She wanted to wrap the bag properly, but Wen Qing immediately grabbed it in her hand. "It's so. Then she looked at the muscular man beside her. "Darling, oh." The muscular man kissed her passionately. His face was red and his heart was racing. Wen Yuan picked up the glass of water to cover up. After the kiss, Wen Qing pouted coquettishly and said that she had taken off her makeup. Then she began to touch up her makeup. At the same time, she said with some disdain, "Sister, it's not that I want to scold you, but look at you dressed like this every day. Why would brother-in-law be interested? There are a lot of women in his company. If you don't take care of yourself, not only will you lose to women, you will also lose to men." Wen Yuan thought to himself, "Is it that exaggerated?" Wen Qing smiled again and said pretentiously, "That's why my brother-in-law won't accompany you anymore." Just as Wen Yuan was about to say something, a large palm pressed down on her shoulder, followed by Yi Mubai's deep voice. "Wen Qing, I don't remember having the hobby you mentioned." Then, he sat beside Wen Yuan and put an arm around her shoulder. "Wen Yuan, you look good like this." Wen Qing laughed exaggeratedly. She lay in the arms of her boyfriend, George, and trembled as if it was a funny thing. Later, she smiled tenderly and said, "Brother-in-law, how did you fall in love with my sister? Look at her age, she doesn't have any interest and she doesn't have any thoughts." Wen Yuan's expression was a little ugly. However, Yi Mubai was indifferent. "I remember that after your birthday, Wen Qing, you will also be 30, right? You will also be one of the old women that you mentioned. Besides, how would others know about the interest of a married couple? As for thoughts," he smiled. "Don't you also like people without thoughts? Oh right, Wen Qing, your boyfriend's Hun muscles are trained really well." He was hinting that Hunda was brainless. Wen Qing was so angry that her face turned pale and red. She stomped her feet and was about to explode. Yi Mubai said coldly, "This bag is worth more than 1,000,000. No matter what, it is Wen Yuan's sincerity towards you. However, the money came out of my pocket. I have the right not to give it to someone who insulted my wife." He reached out and took the bag. "Why don't you do charity?" Wen Yuan was also stunned. She did not expect him to do that. She said softly, "Isn't that too much?" End of chapter. Chapter 39:13. He gave her a sidelong glance. He had always thought that Wen Yuan was too easy to talk to. Wen Yuan did not say anything. Wen Qing's hands were empty. She was dumbfounded. She had been looking for that bag for a long time. Now that she had finally gotten it, how could she let it go? She quickly squeezed out a smile and said coquettishly, "Brother-in-law, I'm just spouting nonsense. Sister is so pretty, of course there will be men who like her." Those words hit Yi Mubai's sore spot. Wen Qing took the bag and looked at their expressions. She thought that she had guessed correctly. Back then, Wen Yuan and Yi Mubai had a falling out because of Kong Qiao. They almost lost their child. She had always said that they shared the same bed but dreamed different dreams. As his sister, she did not look happy at all. She was very restrained in front of Yi Mubai. Actually, Wen Qing did not envy Wen Yuan at all when he was married to Yi Mulin in the past. Yi Mulin was a politician. Her father was also a politician. She had no interest at all. However, Yi Mubai was different. He was a big shot in the entertainment industry now. He had so many resources in his hands. She wanted to be a star too. However, Yi Mubai did not pay much attention to her. She could not do anything about it. Now, Wen Qing had touched the sore spot of their discord, so she smiled sweetly, "My sister likes artsy men, just like Kong Qiao." Right after she said that, Mother Wen came over and reprimanded Wen Qing. "What nonsense are you talking about? He is Teacher Ye's son. Wen Qing, you just have to take care of yourself. Get married soon so that I don't have to worry about you." Wen Qing was very good at acting coquettishly. She hugged Mother Wen's arm. "Don't we have George? George? Elizabeth? He was a Chinese. Why did he have a foreign name? He couldn't make it overseas. When he returned to China, he opened a fake company and became the CEO. Only Wen Qing was so useless. She gave a gift of a few thousand yuan on her first visit. Of course, Mother Wen did not like it. Wen Yuan, on the other hand, was different. When the Wen family was doing well in the past, she married Yi Mulin. Later on, there was a mistake and she married Yi Mubai. In the past, they didn't think highly of her. However, in the past 2 years, Mubai had helped Old Wen establish a lot of connections overseas. This was especially important to the Wen family. Moreover, Mubai was generous to them. Mother Wen was especially polite to Yi Mubai. Of course, this caused Wen Qing to be dissatisfied. She tried to act cute but it was useless. Meanwhile, George left dejectedly. Mother Wen reprimanded her, "Don't bring just anyone into the house. This kind of fake rich man who can't afford a house in B City is waiting to be a Phoenix man. You're not young anymore. Keep your eyes open. Don't fool around all day. You already have a bad reputation." Mother Wen was angry. This daughter was too much. She changed a few boyfriends in a year. She was not worried at all. Wen Qing didn't care. She stretched out her hand and admired her nails. "It's okay. I can't get married. Brother-in-law will take care of me." Mother Wen was speechless. How could she say something like that? Wasn't she afraid that Wen Yuan would be angry? Wen Yuan drank his tea and didn't say anything. Yi Mubai smiled faintly. Wen Qing can go to my company's public relations department. Wen Yuan knew what kind of place Stars Entertainment's public relations department was. It was Su Mo's territory. Many public relations people drank and slept with them. Yi Mubai was quite vicious. Wen Qing wasn't stupid. She could tell that he was mocking her. She pouted and didn't say anything. End of chapter. Chapter 39:14. Yi Mubai got up and pulled Wen Yuan up. He said to Mother Wen, "Mom, Wen Yuan and I are leaving. We'll go and see Yi Fenghui later." Mother Wen was confused. "Aren't you staying for dinner? It's late." He looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan said that you want to buy a gift for Wen Qing. "We are passing by. Let's have dinner next time." After saying that, he looked at Wen Yuan deeply. Mother Wen knew that she had offended Yi Mubai today. Whether it was Wen Qing or her, Yi Mubai was angry, but he restrained himself. He probably felt that he had treated Wen Yuan harshly and allowed Wen Qing to speak without thinking. In fact, Wen Mubai's mother did not think that Yi Mubai cared about Wen Yuan that much in the past. It was only because of the union of their child that Wen Yuan was just hot-headed. But now she didn't think so. It was obvious that Yi Mubai cared about Wen Yuan more than she thought. He said that to warn her. Mother Wen forced a smile. "Okay, next time I come back, I'll cook a table of delicious dishes for you." Yi Mubai smiled slightly and left with Wen Yuan. As soon as they left, Mother Wen turned around. Wen Yuan was sitting on the sofa and admiring his new bag. He was obsessed with it. Mother Wen said coldly, "Wen Qing, be careful of what you say next time." Wen Qing didn't raise her head. She was still admiring the bag with an indifferent expression. "Mom, what do I have to be careful of? I used to talk to Wen Yuan like this, and he didn't get angry. Look, he has no temper now." "But Yi Mubai has a temper." Mother Wen said seriously, "You have to be careful." "What's there to be careful about? They don't have a good relationship. Brother-in-law suspects that my sister has a mistress. They will divorce sooner or later." As Wen Qing spoke, she suddenly thought of something. Her eyes flashed with an evil light. My sister can marry them. After they divorce, brother-in-law can marry me too." Mother Wen was stunned. When she came back to herself, she slapped Wen Qing immediately. She was so angry that she almost fainted. "Shut up. I won't forgive you if you say such words again." Wen Qing covered her face and bit her lips. "Mom, you are biased. Wen Mubai is your brother-in-law. Remember this clearly. If you dare to do anything, I'll break your legs. Otherwise, you can leave the Wen family." Wen Mubai's mother was extremely angry. "Since when did your values become so skewed?" Wen Qing was not convinced. "Why can't I be better than Wen Yuan? I'm younger than her and I know how to dress up, but she only knows how to seduce men. Yi Mubai has long since abandoned her." Mother Wen was so angry that she didn't want to talk with her and went back to sleep. Wen Qing, you really lost your face for a few bags." She was so Wen that she didn't want to talk with her. Qing said. Wen Qing was. Qing. She was really furious. Wen Qing and Wen Yuan had completely different personalities, but both were worrisome. Wen Yuan was Qing. Wen Wenmu was right. Wen Qing and Wen Yuan was. Wen Qing was. Wen Qing's right. Yi was. Wen Wenmu and Yi was. Ti Qing. Mubai had seen all kinds of beautiful girls in the entertainment circle. If one day he felt Wen Yuan was boring and tired of her, what would Wen Yuan do? When Wen Qing's mother was worried, Yi Mubai got in the car with Wen Yuan. When he started the car, he said, "Go to my mother's place?" Wen Yuan looked at the time. It was already past 12 o'clock. It was impolite to go there at this time. Besides, Yi Fenghui would take a nap. End of this chapter. Chapter 39:15. "Let's eat outside," he said. Wen Yuan glanced at him and didn't object. He drove her to a vegetarian restaurant. The business was good and it was lunchtime, so there were many people. Yi Mubai went over and the manager led her to the private room. She could tell that he came here often. The private room wasn't very big, but it was clean and elegant. The waiter immediately brought a pot of good tea and asked for their order. Yi Mubai said calmly that it was the same as before. Mr. and Mrs. Yi, please wait a moment. The waiter smiled. Wen Yuan took a sip of the tea. It was surprisingly good, so she took a few more sips. Yi Mubai watched the waiter leave and then looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and drank his tea. He looked at her clothes again. Actually, what Wen Qing said was true. Wen Yuan usually dressed up like an older man and did not look outstanding. The reason why he never objected to it was because when she was at home, they spent most of their time in bed. He cared more about her body. He was the only one who knew about his wife's body. It was best if other men didn't know about it. This was Yi Mubai's dark thoughts. When Yuan looked up and saw him, his gaze also fell on her face. After looking at each other for a long time, he smiled faintly. The tea here is very good. She made a sound of uneasiness. Yi Mubai also picked up the teacup and took a sip. After a while, he suddenly asked, "Does it still hurt?" When Yuan was startled and then bit her lower lip. He watched her expression and chuckled softly. He wasn't sorry at all for his bad behavior last night. When Yuan drank half a cup of tea, just when she was about to talk to him about what happened last night, the waiter had already entered and she could only forget about it. All the dishes were served. There were 6 dishes and 1 soup. It looked very good. Yi Mubai picked up a piece of vegetable for her. Try this. She was actually not used to it. She rarely ate alone with him. It was either at his parents' place, at her parents' house, or at a banquet. So it was rare for them to eat face to face. She ate silently. It was surprisingly good. She looked up and saw his deep gaze again. When Yuan asked softly, "Why aren't you eating?" He took a sip of tea. "How is it?" "Pretty good." She smiled and watched the waiter leave. Then her gaze landed on Yi Mubai again. Just as she was about to speak, he put down his glass and looked at her. "When Yuan, are you sure you want to talk about this with me now?" She was stunned, and his voice became hoarser. "We'll talk about it tonight." For a moment, she was speechless and didn't say anything. Yeah, this is not a good place to talk about things. During the meal, he didn't eat much, but when Yuan ate quite a lot. When he left, he paid the bill. Then he looked into the distance. "Looks like you like this place." For a moment, she didn't know why he was suddenly so nice to her. He wasn't like this in the past. Only in bed, torturing her. "When Yuan, it's not that I don't want to be good to you, it's that you didn't give me a chance." He smiled slightly and reached out to hold her hand. She wanted to pull away, but he didn't let her. After that, he held her hand all the way to the parking lot. He opened the car door for Wen Yuan to get in. When he got in the car himself, he suddenly said, "It's still early. Let's go to the mall." End of this chapter. Chapter 39:16. When Yuan's face was to the side. Hearing his words, he turned around and looked at him for a long time before saying, "I don't have anything to buy." Yi Mubai looked at her quietly. "I want to buy something for you, Wen Yuan. Don't you think it's weird for us to be like this?" She looked down. This is the life of a housewife. It's not as good as a professional woman. He sat, rubbing his chin with his fingers, and said very slowly, "You still want to go to work?" She did not make a sound. He continued, "Wen Yuan, is this the only way to please you?" Surprised by his choice of words, she stared at him blankly. Yi Mubai smiled. "If you want to open a music store or go to a school to teach, it's fine." She looked at him in surprise. His hands were on the steering wheel, and his smile deepened. "But I have a condition." Wen Yuan said subconsciously, "I can stay at home." He chuckled softly. He didn't mention any conditions, nor did he mention anything about going to work. He just started the car. After a while, the car arrived at Yintai Square. He got out of the car first. Wen Yuan didn't want to get out. He went around to open the car door for her. "Wen Yuan, there's a hotel up ahead. I heard the suites are not bad." She glared at her and got out of the car slowly. When her feet touched the ground, she frowned. Yi Mubai noticed. He held her, his voice a little hoarse. "It won't happen again." He was indeed too rude last night. Wen Yuan didn't say anything and walked in with him. They had almost never shopped together, except for that one time when they got married. She didn't know what he was going to buy for her, so she just followed him. She thought that he would buy clothes for her because Wenqing had given him a cold shoulder today, but he didn't. Instead, he took her to a lingerie and pajamas shop. "I don't need this." She bit her lip and refused to go in. Yi Mubai said calmly, "You can wear whatever you want outside, and I don't think your taste is so bad that it can't be seen. But pajamas and underwear are the rights of a husband." When Yuan bit his lip, "I do." Yi Mubai looked at her and said airily, "The style is too conservative." He was walking in front of her. She immediately pulled him back. "Yi Mubai, I didn't." He looked at her seriously and smiled. Men have the final say in this kind of thing. When Yuan was a little angry, but she also knew that if she didn't go along with him, he would probably play those perverted games again at night. She was really afraid. Yi Mubai directly walked into a very high-end lingerie shop. A set of clothes started from tens of thousands of yuan. When Yuan said softly, "Wait for me outside," Yi Mubai frowned. "Aren't your feet hurting? Sit down, I'll help you choose." When Yuan wasn't willing, but he was very strong. In the end she could only sit there, pretending not to know him, and turn her face away. Yi Yiri. Ti. 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 Tim. When he looked at her and smiled warmly. When Yuan turned her face away, unwilling to look at him again. There weren't many customers in the store, but there were a few women. Surprisingly, he didn't seem out of place and was carefully choosing for her. He spent more than half an hour helping her pick out 4 sets of underwear and 3 sets of pajamas. Although they weren't very sexy, they were still very feminine. When Yuan watched him pay with his card, and his face was a little hot. End of chapter. Chapter 39:17. Yi Mubai was very at ease. He walked towards her with the bag. "Let's go." She got up and followed behind him. "You agreed to let me teach." Yi Mubai didn't stop walking. "You like being a teacher so much?" Her voice was very soft. "I don't want to stay at home all the time. It's too leisurely." "Yi Mubai, you don't want me to play mahjong all day, do you?" This time, he stopped walking and looked at her face quietly. After a while he smiled. "Actually, there's nothing wrong with that." When Yuan looked at him quietly. Now she understood that he had just said it casually when he agreed to let her work. He didn't take it seriously at all. Yi Mubai smiled again. "Are you angry?" This time, when Yuan walked in front. He was obviously angry. And he stood there for a while before he followed. After getting into the car, the atmosphere was a little gloomy. He held the steering wheel with both hands and was silent for a while before he said, "When Yuan, let me think about it." With that, he turned his head and looked at her quietly. "You know what I mind." At this moment, the oppressive feeling from his body came again. It was a familiar feeling. All the previous ease was an illusion. The reason why he didn't let her work was because he didn't want her to come into contact with Kanxiao. He didn't trust her. When Yuan's expression slowly became cold. She looked at him and didn't say anything. After a while, she turned her head away and looked out of the window. At this moment, it was as if the magic disappeared. All the previous ease disappeared, and they returned to before. Yi Mubai's fingers held the steering wheel and his voice was low and hoarse. "When Yuan, wait until..." He looked at her sideways. "Wait until you love me." She looked at him and finally knew that there were some things that he wouldn't allow. Suddenly, her strength seemed to be drained. She leaned against the back of the seat and said weakly, "Yi Mubai, you don't have to do this." After the hope, there was deep disappointment. Perhaps he thought that she was rich and good as Mrs. Yi, but she wasn't happy at all. Not at all. And he didn't know. When Yuan didn't say anything. He pursed his lips and looked out of the window, feeling a little tired. His heart was very tired. Yi Mubai started the car and went to Su Fu and Hao Yun's place. Because of their quarrel, when Yuan had no intention of bringing Yi Hui back after seeing her. She was a little disheartened. Regarding this marriage, if it was just a matter of making do with it before, now she really did not know how to get along with him. He was always too egotistical, always deciding everything for them. His desire to control was getting stronger and stronger. He wasn't like this before. Wen Yuan thought silently as he leaned back in his chair. At this time, he had left dinner at Su Fu's place and coaxed Yi Hui to sleep. It was already 10 o'clock. When Yuan looked out of the window and at the neon lights that filled the sky, he felt a little complicated. Yi Mubai was focused on driving and had no intention of speaking. The atmosphere was rather tense. Half an hour later, the car stopped at the villa and Wen Yuan got off. Then, Yi Mubai opened the car door and got off. He looked at her back and then at the clothes he had bought in the car. He picked them up and followed her. He walked into the hall. Because it was too late, most of the servants in the house were asleep. It seemed lonely and empty. He looked up and saw that Wen Yuan had already reached the second floor. Yi Mubai smoked downstairs and then went upstairs. End of this chapter. Chapter 39:18. When he pushed open the bedroom door, he saw Wen Yuan sitting there without taking a shower or sleeping. He seemed to be waiting for him. He put the bag on the sofa beside her and put down his coat. He smiled faintly. "You don't like it?" Wen Yuan shook his head. "No." He sat down and smiled again. "Are you still angry about what happened in the afternoon?" "What about you?" Wen Yuan looked into his eyes. "Yi Mubai, are you still angry about what happened that day?" "Yes." He gave her an affirmative answer. "I'm angry because I care about you." Wen Yuan laughed angrily. "Really? What about you?" "Lin Cece, Lin Danny, how many times do I have to be angry?" "Yi Mubai, I admit that I liked you in the past, but I don't have to like you. It's my freedom." After she said that, she saw that his face was very ugly. He stared at her in shock and said slowly, "You finally said it. You don't like me." "Wen Yuan, who else can you like? Kanxiao? I want to see what you can still like about him when he's nothing." Wen Yuan's breath stopped for a moment. Then she blinked her eyes gently. She couldn't believe that he would say such a thing. "Yi Mubai, can you not be so despicable?" "Sure." He leaned over and put his arm around her head, pressing his face against hers. He whispered hoarsely, "As long as you love me." Wen Yuan's voice trembled. "Our matters have nothing to do with others." "Yi Mubai, you can't, I can." He stared into her eyes and said word by word, "Wen Yuan, you know I can, from the moment you met him." "I said I don't want to see him, didn't I?" Her face was close to his and tears fell from her closed eyes. "Yi Mubai, it wasn't like this in the past." "Yes, it was like this in the past. I felt guilty and regretful, so I tacitly agreed that you and Kanxiao Yuan had been going back and forth for 2 to 3 years. You were so happy when you received his gift that you would read it alone in the study for 2 hours. At that time..." He stared at her expression. "Did you ever think that I was your husband? At that time, you only thought of other men." "I didn't." She didn't want to explain to him that those were all sent by Kang Qiao. They were all places she had talked about with him before. Every time he went to a place, he would send a gift to show her, pretending that she had been there. But even this was interpreted by Yi Mubai as flirting. She denied it, but he didn't believe her. He narrowed his eyes and stared into her eyes. His voice was very soft. "Don't tell me that you don't have any feelings for him." "Not at all. It's not like that. I really didn't." Wen Yuan finally couldn't take it anymore and pushed him away almost frantically. "Yi Mubai, don't add to the drama." He smiled. "If you want me to believe you, sure." She looked at him, her heart heaving. His thin lips gently spat out a few words, "Please me." Wen Yuan was shocked. Then he said very softly, "Yi Mubai, we are husband and wife." He reached out and placed his hand on her face. His slender fingers gently stroked her delicate skin. His voice was soft and hoarse. "This kind of thing between husband and wife is very common. Didn't I do it for you?" His fingers gently touched her red lips, as if he was playing with her, but it was more like he was teasing her emotions. He just wanted her to lose control. "I remember that you liked to do it in the past. Why don't you love me anymore? Can't your body accept it?" End of this chapter. Chapter 39:19. He leaned forward again and pressed his lips against her ear. His voice was sexy and clear. I heard that many women like this. When you don't like it, huh? She simply couldn't listen to it anymore. She bit her lip. I'm not as despicable as you. Really? He stopped smiling. Kong Xiao and you platonic? As he said that, he grabbed her hair. He didn't use much strength, but it still hurt her. Wen Yuan endured the pain and slowly raised her head. Are you going to be rough with me again? No. He smiled lightly and quickly let go of her. His eyes glanced at the panties and pajamas on the side, and he smiled bitterly. He said, Wen Yuan, I feel that nothing can move you. No matter how hard I try to be a good husband and a good father, you don't seem to see it. She lowered her eyes. She didn't understand why he said that he would wait for her to love her. And now he was like this. Were all men fickle? Yi Mubai got up and walked to the bedroom door. He didn't say anything, but Wen Yuan knew that he was really sleeping in separate rooms with her. She actually didn't care, and he was angry that she didn't care. She sat quietly for a while and went to take a shower. After changing into her pajamas, she couldn't fall asleep. Every time she quarreled with Yi Mubai, she would go to the study to look at the things that Kong Xiao gave her. Wen Yuan carried a big box and walked to the desk. He opened it and took out a lot of things. Even if it was a leaf, it still represented freedom. She looked at it quietly. Marrying Yi Mubai didn't mean that she would lose herself. She now felt more and more. He didn't understand her. Wen Yuan picked up a specimen and thought bitterly. Maybe Yi Mubai didn't have the time, effort, and interest to understand her. He bought her panties and pajamas just for physical enjoyment. Just now, when he said that, she felt very insulted. In his heart, was there only sex between a couple? Her dreams were worthless in his heart. She thought, there's nothing to explain. Sleep in separate rooms, Cold War, Cold War. When she put the box away, she turned around and saw Yi Mubai's expressionless face. He was standing by the door, wearing a black nightgown. His entire temperament was so gloomy that it seemed like he could grow black wings at any time. Wen Yuan stood there without moving. He stared at her and smiled. Done admiring? With that, he turned around and left. Hence, the Cold War began. Other than restraining himself in front of Xiangnan, he pretended to be calm. But in private, although they lived in the same villa, they almost never saw each other. Even if they did see each other, they treated each other as air. Of course, this kind of Cold War was mostly one-sided by Yi Mubai. Wen Yuan had been very calm, as if nothing had happened. He came back later and later. Just like before, there would occasionally be some tidbits of news that would appear on the entertainment headlines. True or false, it was quite difficult for Stars Entertainment's public relations department to handle. This kind of thing could just be done with public relations. Why would they need to make it onto the headlines? On a weekend afternoon, Su Mo asked Wen Yuan out for tea. It was a quiet afternoon, and everything was very comfortable. The two of them sat facing each other. Su Mo lowered her head and gently stirred the liquid in the coffee cup. She took a sip and looked up. Wen Yuan, how's the relationship between you and your wife recently? Why do you ask? Wen Yuan smiled and took a sip. It was a little bitter because she didn't put sugar in it. End of this chapter. Chapter 39:20. Su Mo rolled her eyes. Don't you watch the news? Wen Yuan stirred the spoon gently. Are you talking about those scandals? Su Mo was quite shameless in front of Yi Mubai, but she was still very reliable when it came to Wen Yuan. Scandals can also become true. Wen Yuan, haven't you been taking President Yi too lightly in the past 2 years? That woman's whole body was almost hanging on President Yi in the news yesterday. I won't say anything more. Anyway, let me remind you that if a man is hungry for a long time, even a sow will look handsome. Wen Yuan couldn't help laughing. Are you soaking in the jar again? Su Mo said seriously, but there's nothing wrong with what you said. Anyway, President Yi went for a drink alone with the investor last night after the banquet. I heard it from Secretary He. It's absolutely reliable. Wen Yuan, grow up. So many women are eyeing Yi Mubai. He's handsome, rich, and has a child. Which woman doesn't like him? Only you can stay calm. Su Mo felt a little angry at the end of her words. Some people could easily have everything, but they still felt that it was nothing. When Yuan was like this, so she was anxious for him. When Yuan brushed his hair. You've said it hundreds of times. I still say the same thing. If you can live, then live. If you can't, he will let go. Su Mo was a little sad. She reached out and placed her hand on the back of Wen Yuan's hand. The past is the past. Wen Yuan, you have to look forward. Yes, you do blame him and hate him, but try to accept your current life. You'll feel better. Wen Yuan smiled desolately. I want to live a good life, but he needs me to live according to his way. Su Mo, it's very hard for me. Su Mo sighed. Wen Yuan, do you know how many women envy your life? You don't have to work hard and you can do whatever you want. Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and smiled when he looked up. Su Mo, do you want such a life? Will you feel very happy? You're not allowed to do what you want. The only thing you're allowed to do is stay at home with the children or go shopping. Su Mo asked in a low voice, do you still play the piano? Very little. He bought a grand piano and put it at home. I used to play it, but now I'm really not interested. Su Mo, I feel that my married life is getting more and more boring. I feel like I'm just a decoration in his house. Wen Yuan said in a low voice, his business has been very big in the past 2 years. His company went public and so many women threw themselves at him. I feel like an old woman at home. I have to make myself beautiful in case my husband cheats. When Wen Yuan first started to like Yi Mubai, and even when she married him, he wasn't like this. She liked that kind of carefreeness, not the controlling desire he had right now. Su Mo licked his lips. Wen Yuan, have you ever thought that CEO Yi is doing this because he cares? He doesn't care. She's do. He can do whatever he like. Mo do with he do what he does. Mo tests controlling because heat. There's nothing wrong with starting over, Wen Yuan said faintly. Right, didn't he say he was with you? Mose yonked about. Su Mo Mose it when ate she about that. Then, the two of them fell silent. Su Mo put his hand on the back of her hand and whispered, I like Kong Qiao, but he likes you. Wen Yuan, you really can think about it. Choose between Kong Qiao and Zhou Yi. I don't think you're as unmoved as you said. I've seen it all these years. Really, think about it. He's a good man and he's been waiting for you. Wen Yuan subconsciously shook his head. Su Mo smiled lightly again. Don't think about it for me. I really don't want a man who doesn't like me. Why bother asking for trouble? Wen Yuan sighed. It's impossible for me and Kong Qiao. Sometimes, just a little bit more, not now, but before I met Yi Mubai. Now I don't love Yi Mubai anymore, and it seems that I don't have the ability to love someone else. I can't find that feeling of falling in love at first sight anymore. Actually, it wasn't that she couldn't find it. There were, for example, the day when he brought her to the vegetarian restaurant. Even though it was just a meal, it was different in Wen Yuan's heart. He hadn't said those words later on, she would have thought that she was in love again. She was a little disappointed, but she didn't want to tell him. After parting with Su Mo, Wen Yuan saw that it was getting late, so she called the chauffeur at home. She went to pick up Xiangnan from school. After picking up Xiangnan was very happy. He ran over and hugged her. Mom. Wen Yuan took the school bag from his son's hand and smiled. Mom will take you to eat delicious food. Xiangnan raised his little face. What about dinner? Dad said that we can't eat a lot of junk food outside. It's okay to eat a little. Wen Yuan changed the topic. But if you don't like it, we won't eat it. Xiangnan was anxious. Isn't it okay to eat a little bit? Wen Yuan smiled and took his son to the car. After fastening the seatbelt, she turned to Xiangnan in the back seat and said, Don't tell Dad. Xiangnan happily said that he wouldn't. When Wen Yuan started the car, there was a faint smile on her face. With Xiangnan and Yi Hui, the days wouldn't be too difficult. For Yi Mubai, it wasn't too bad to exercise at night. But recently he didn't. After a few days, the couple slept in separate rooms. He didn't look for Wen Yuan, and it was even more impossible for Wen Yuan to look for him. So he just owed her. Both physically and mentally, Yi Mubai was seriously suppressed. He came back early today. When he got home, he asked the servants. The servants said that Madam went out and picked up Xiangnan. Yi Mubai looked at the time. It was already 5:30. It was long past time. He threw his coat on the sofa and sat down. He took out his phone and looked at it. Then he made a call. When Wen Yuan received Yi Mubai's call, she was in KFC with Xiangnan. Xiangnan's expression as he held the fried chicken was very indescribable. It was as if it was an incredible delicacy. She thought he's always a child. At this moment, when she heard Yi Mubai's voice, she was a little embarrassed. Where are you and Xiangnan? Yi Mubai pulled his tie. When Yuan looked at Xiangnan holding the chicken wing bucket with his eyes wide open, she felt a little distressed. They only ate once a year. If she went back now, Xiangnan would be very disappointed. So she lied, I'm in the bookstore with Xiangnan. Yi Mubai paused for a moment and then said with certainty, Wen Yuan, you're lying. When he said these words, Wen Yuan felt as if she was being judged. Xiangnan was sick, but he recovered. Moreover, Qin Chen also said that he was a healthy child. There was no need to raise him so expensive. It was not good for boys. But Yi Mubai insisted that Xiangnan was not allowed to eat outside. Wen Yuan was helpless but had no choice. She could only sneak Xiangnan out occasionally and eat a little. End of this chapter. Chapter 39:21. Yi Mubai waited for her silence for a long time, so he said coldly, I can smell the fried chicken here. His tone was cold and mocking. Wen Yuan was stabbed and blurted out, I feel disgusted by what you did outside even through the screen. Yi Mubai was stunned. He didn't expect Wen Yuan to say that. Wen Yuan was also stunned, but then she couldn't help feeling happy. She then made a big decision. I'll stay in a hotel with Xiangnan today. I won't go back. Anyway, they would sleep in separate rooms if they went back. It didn't make any difference. Yi Mubai frowned. Wen Yuan, do you know what you're talking about? You're not a child anymore. Now you're running away from home with me? What do you want? Divorce? Wen Yuan listened to his almost exasperated tone. She was very calm. After a long time, she only said one sentence, Yi Mubai, if that's what you want. After she finished speaking, she hung up the phone. After hanging up the phone, she was a little worried about Xiangnan. She was afraid that he would be unhappy, but Xiangnan's eyes were already wide open. His voice was trembling with excitement. Mom, aren't we going home today? Before Wen Yuan could answer, Xiangnan said again, I want to stay in a theme hotel. I also want Bai Anan to stay with me. Mom, can you call Auntie Shirley? Wen Yuan was completely stunned. She wanted to ask Xiangnan, but Xiangnan had already lowered his head and happily ate the fried chicken. After eating 2 pieces of chicken legs, he couldn't bear to eat anymore. He said pitifully, Mom, I'll keep this to eat with Anan. Her father doesn't allow her to eat it either. Wen Yuan couldn't tell what she was feeling in her heart. Then she thought about it and said, Can we pick up Yi Hui? If you can't eat it, then don't eat it. Mom can order delivery from the hotel later. Xiangnan thought about it. Yi Hui could also eat it, but Yi Hui had just grown a mouth of small teeth and couldn't eat a lot of things. But Xiangnan was a little warm man, so he said shyly, I'll feed it to my sister. Wen Yuan smiled and led Xiangnan into the car. She drove directly to Su Fu's place. It was already dinner time, so it was a little abrupt and not Wen Yuan's usual style. Su Fu was eating with Xiao Yi. The little fellow was wearing a pretty little dress and was sitting upright. When he saw Wen Yuan and Xiangnan coming over, he happily called out to his mother and brother. Su Fu was also surprised, but she immediately asked the auntie at home to pack the food, and Hao Yun went to do it himself. Thank you, Uncle Hao. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. He carried Xiangnan to the seat and sat down to chat with Su Fu. Su Fu looked at Wen Yuan. Are you here to pick up Yi Hui? Wen Yuan actually wanted to take care of Yi Hui by her side for a long time, but now that she and Yi Mubai were in such a mess, she thought about it and gave up. I want to take Yi Hui back for a night and send her back tomorrow, Wen Yuan said softly. Su Fu was sure that there was something wrong with the couple's relationship. Actually, as parents, they could see that their relationship had not been good for the past 2 years. It was neither cold nor cold. The problem was still in the past. No one could do anything about the knot in Wen Yuan's heart. No matter how handsome and rich her son was, he was not attractive to Wen Yuan. She saw it and knew that Wen Yuan liked the Mubai of the past. Now, it was very difficult. Wen Yuan was like her in the past. She used to love Yi Jinggang very much. She loved him for many years, but after what happened with Mubai and Shueli, she could not love him anymore. Now, there was also Hao Yun by Wen Yuan's side. This person was Kong Qiao, the knot in Mubai's heart. End of this chapter. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.